My mother's voice was as sharp as a winter frost. Cutting through the phone line, 25 guests, Clara. The silver must be polished, the goose stuffed, and the house spotless. Don't be late, I whispered, a soft, obedient, of course, mother. I didn't tell her I was already standing in the departure hall of the airport. I didn't tell her that for years I had been the silent foundation of their grand, crumbling lives. By the time they sat down to a table of nothing, they realized the true cost of the daughter they had treated as a servant. Before we continue this story, take a moment to check in down in the comments. Where are you watching this video from today? We'd truly love to see how far this story has reached and which corner of the world you're joining us from. And don't forget to subscribe, so we can continue bringing you powerful stories filled with inspiration, emotion, and meaningful life lessons that stay with you long after the video ends. The air inside the departures terminal of London Heathrow was stripped of all human comfort, smelling faintly of aviation fuel, sterile industrial disinfectant, and the collective anxiety of thousands of souls in transit. It was a biting, artificial atmosphere. Yet, to Clara Whitmore, it felt like the first clean oxygen she had inhaled in 34 years. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass panes, the gray Berkshire sky hung low and heavy, pregnant with the promise of a classic, unyielding British blizzard. Outside, the tarmac was a bleak canvas of concrete and flashing yellow lights. Inside, Clara stood perfectly still, a single leather suitcase at her side, wrapped in a wool coat that did not belong to the thrift store wardrobe her family had deemed appropriate for her. Then, the small rectangular screen of her phone burst into predatory life. The ringtone did not merely sound, it invaded. On the display, the name *mother* flashed with a cold, rhythmic persistence. Instantly, the modern, bustling acoustics of the airport, the chime of boarding announcements, the soft rumble of luggage wheels, the murmur of travelers eager to reach their holiday destinations, seemed to recede into a suffocating vacuum. The phone in Clara's palm grew instantly heavy. It was a physical sensation, a sudden thickening of gravity that pulled at her wrists, her shoulders, her very spine. It felt precisely like the cold, unyielding iron of a slave's shackle, a weight she had carried so long that her posture had permanently adapted to its burden. She did not answer on the first ring, nor the second. She allowed the vibration to thrum against her skin, a cruel reminder of the Pavlovian terror that had governed her entire existence for 34 years. A call from Eleanor Whitmore meant an immediate cessation of Clara's own life. It meant a demand, an emergency born of vanity, or a reprimand delivered with the casual precision of an aristocrat swatting a fly. With a thumb that trembled despite the iron fortitude locked deep within her chest, Clara slid the bar across the screen and pressed the device to her ear. She did not say hello. She knew better than to interrupt the monologue that was already waiting to pour through the receiver. Clara, where on earth are you? Eleanor's voice did not travel through the miles of cellular network. It seemed to materialize directly from the frost outside, carrying the familiar, jagged edge of a midwinter gale. There was no greeting, no inquiry into her well-being, no acknowledgement that the holidays were a time for familial warmth. Eleanor spoke with the absolute, terrifying confidence of a woman who believed the sun rose and set purely by her permission. The catering van from the village has had an absolute catastrophe with their radiator, and they won't be here until 5, which means the heavy lifting falls entirely upon us. 25 guests, Clara, Lord and Lady Hetherington, are bringing their eldest son, and Richard's business associates from the city are expecting nothing less than a traditional, flawless country estate Christmas. The silver in the long gallery hasn't been touched since Michaelmas. It looks positively industrial. The goose needs to be brined with the juniper berries I ordered from the organic market, and the hearths in the drawing room must be laid with seasoned ash, not the birch. Clara, the birch spits too many sparks, and Vanessa is wearing her cream silk gown. Every noun was a stone, every verb was a lash. The sheer density of the demands was designed to overwhelm, to paralyze the listener into immediate, unthinking compliance. As Eleanor spoke, Clara could vividly visualize the stage being set at Whitmore Manor, the sprawling, damp, endlessly demanding Georgian estate in the Cotswolds that her family poured every penny into maintaining, purely to keep up the illusion of landed gentry. She could see her mother pacing the stone floors of the morning room, wrapped in a cashmere shawl, a clipboard in one hand, her eyes scanning the house for flaws, while her fingers adjusted the pearls at her throat. "Are you listening to me, child?" Eleanor's voice dropped an octave, the temperature plunging with it. "I asked you a question. Why haven't you arrived yet? Your sister Vanessa has been helping me coordinate the floral arrangements all morning, and her hands are absolutely raw from the holly wire. She shouldn't be doing this kind of manual labor during her holiday. She needs to rest before the evening." The mention of Vanessa was the familiar twist of the knife. Vanessa, the golden child. Vanessa, whose hands were deemed too precious for holly wire, while Clara's hands had been burned by lye, scarred by oyster shucks, and roughened by decades of scrubbing the very grease from the ovens that roasted the family's festive birds. Clara closed her eyes. Beneath her eyelids, the history of her servitude played out in a mosaic of gray mornings and aching joints. She remembered the Christmas she was 12, spending the entire eve in a freezing scullery because she had accidentally chipped a willow-patterned gravy boat, while Vanessa sat by the roaring fire, opening boxes of imported chocolates. She remembered the birthdays forgotten, the achievements ignored, the quiet, systemic erasure of her humanity until she was nothing more than a ghost who kept the machinery of their vanity running. "Clara," Eleanor snapped, her patience evaporating like breath in cold air, "speak to me. Tell me you are on the road." Clara opened her eyes. She looked down at her left hand. It was holding a small, crisp slip of paper. "British Airways, First Class, Terminal 5 to Miami International Airport. Departure time, 1945. A profound, unnatural stillness washed over her. The years of tears, the hundreds of silent nights spent weeping into her pillow until her throat was raw. The desperate, pathetic prayers for her mother to look at her just once with a shred of genuine tenderness. Soul of it seemed to crystallize into a hard, diamond-sharp bead of absolute indifference. The grief was gone. In its place was something far more dangerous to the Whitmore dynasty. Clarity. "Of course, Mother," Clara whispered. Her voice was flat, devoid of the frantic, apologetic energy Eleanor usually demanded. It was the voice of an obedient servant repeating a well-worn script, a vocal camouflage she had perfected over a decade of planning this very hour. "Good," Eleanor barked, entirely missing the deadness in her daughter's tone because she had never truly listened to the sound of Clara's voice anyway. "Don't use the back lane. The snow is drifting by the old oak. Come straight through the stable yard and bring the extra crates of clementines from the larder before you take your coat off. And for heaven's sake, dress properly before the guests arrive. I won't have you looking like a charity case in front of the Hetheringtons. I will ensure everything is handled exactly as it should be," Clara said softly. The line went dead with a sharp, aggressive click. Eleanor didn't say goodbye. One does not say goodbye to the grandfather clock or the kitchen range when one is finished using them. One simply walks away. Clara slowly lowered the phone. The screen dimmed, the predatory light fading into black. She stood in the center of the terminal, surrounded by the rush of the world, and felt the immense, ancient architecture of her family's control shatter into thousands of insignificant pieces. She turned her gaze to the boarding gate across the concourse. Her hand tightened around the passport Chiquita leather cover she had bought for herself, stamped with her own initials, purchased with money her family had no idea she possessed. For 12 years, while they believed she was a failed, freelance copywriter, barely scraping together enough for rent, she had been building a corporate consultancy firm that handled international logistical restructuring for FTSE 100 companies. She had hidden her wealth, her offices in the city, her 28 employees, and her brilliant, ruthless CFO, Oliver Hart. She had hidden it all because she knew that the moment the Whitmores discovered her success, they would find a way to cannibalize it, to claim it as their own, to turn her professional triumph into another ledger of family obligation. She had let them think she was small. She had let them think she was a failure. She had worn the faded sweaters to their dinners. She had driven the dented hatchback up their gravel driveway. She had accepted their insults with a bowed head, all while quietly purchasing the distressed bonds of her father's company, quietly buying up the secondary mortgages on Whitmore Manor, and systematically preparing the trapdoors beneath their gilded cage. The announcement for her flight chimed through the terminal speakers, the chime melodic and light, like a silver bell shattering glass. British Airways flight, BA 209 to Miami, is now ready for boarding at gate A12. All first-class passengers are invited to proceed to the aircraft. Clara pulled the handle of her suitcase up. She didn't look back at the exit that led to the motorway, toward the cold hills of Gloucestershire where 25 aristocrats were preparing to eat a dinner that would never be cooked. She walked toward the gate, her step light, her breath steady, leaving the winter frost of Eleanor's world behind to burn in its own cold negligence. The jet engine's low, predatory hum vibrated through the floorboards of the aircraft. a deep sonic bass line that seemed to physically rattle the marrow of Clara's bones as she sank into the plush leather of seat 2A. The cabin crew, gliding silently in their tailored navy uniforms, offered flutes of vintage champagne and warm towels scented with eucalyptus, treating her with the quiet, unearned reverence reserved for those who fly at the front of the plane. But as Clara leaned her head back against the pristine headrest and closed her eyes, the luxurious reality of the present dissolved, swallowed whole by the dark, cavernous vault of her own memory. In the quiet of her mind, the ghosts did not merely surface. They demanded an audience. For Clara, childhood had never been a season of unburdened laughter, or summer afternoons spent chasing dragonflies across the manicured lawns of Whitmore Manor. It had been a relentless, exhausting lesson in mathematics. She could see herself clearly now, a frail, pale girl of 7, standing on a wooden milk crate in the damp scullery. Her small hands submerged in water so hot it turned her skin a raw, weeping crimson. The steam rose around her face like a mocking mist, carrying the sharp, chemical sting of carbolic soap. Above her stood Eleanor, not a mother offering a gentle hand, but an auditor reviewing an unsatisfactory balance sheet. A family is not a charity. Clara, Eleanor had whispered on that long-forgotten winter evening, her voice a smooth, cold pebble of absolute conviction. Every privilege you enjoy under this roof, the bread you eat, the coal that warms your bed, the very clothes on your back must be earned. We do not tolerate freeloaders in this house. That was the night the invisible book was opened, the ledger of debt. In the Whitmore household, parental affection was never an innate right. It was a luxury commodity, highly inflated and tightly regulated. It was a cruel, unwritten system of accounting where every crumb of warmth was priced in manual labor. Clara learned to read the fluctuating market of her mother's moods with the precision of a day trader. A simple, passing birthday hug the kind she watched the mothers at her school give their children without a single thought cost Clara 3 solid days of scrubbing the cold flagstones of the East Wing until her knees were black with bruises and her knuckles split open from the damp frost. If she desired a kind word, a single sentence of validation, like good girl, Clara, she knew the price ahead of time. It was the interest accrued from weeks of sitting in the drafts of the linen room, her vision blurring as she mended the delicate, agonizingly intricate lace trim on her father's dress shirts by the failing light of a single candle stub. She remembered the summer she turned 10, the year Vanessa had been gifted a pedigree pony with a silver-mounted saddle for achieving mediocre marks in her French exams. Clara, who had finished top of her entire class in mathematics and literature, had presented her report card to her father in the library, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, hoping for a sliver of the praise heaped upon her sister. Richard Whitmore had not looked up from his bank ledgers. He had merely adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles, his thumb tracing the edge of a mahogany desk that cost more than a working man's annual salary. Academic vanity does not clean the stables. Clara, he had muttered, his voice flat, devoid of malice, but dripping with an indifference that cut deeper than any physical blow. Your sister brings prestige to our name through her deportment. You are the eldest. Your duty is to ensure the estate runs smoothly. Go find your mother. The cook says the larder needs sorting before the evening delivery. No congratulations. No embrace. Just an invoice for more labor. Clara spent that entire glorious July evening in the subterranean dark of the manor larder, sorting rotting potatoes from the fresh ones, the foul, sweet stench of decomposition filling her throat until she gagged. With every heavy sack she dragged across the stone floor, her small body aching with a fatigue no child should ever know, she updated the ledger in her mind. She realized, with a devastating, adult clarity that shattered the last remnants of her childhood innocence, that she was not a daughter in this house. She was a tenant. She was a debtor, trapped in a generational cycle of indentured servitude, paying a lifetime mortgage of grueling, unacknowledged labor for a life she had never asked to be given. The emotional cruelty was systemic, a slow-dripping poison that trained her to believe her existence was fundamentally flawed, a deficit that had to be continuously corrected by self-obliteration. Vanessa was born an asset. Clara was born a liability. Vanessa's tantrums were treated as high-spirited artistic temperament. Clara's rare tears were punished as insubordination and ungrateful selfishness. She remembered a specific Christmas Eve-ish. She must have been 14 when she had come down with a raging, delirious fever. Her chest rattled with every breath, and her head felt as though it were being crushed between 2 iron plates. Yet, the house was preparing for the annual Boxing Day hunt breakfast, and there were 40 guests arriving. Eleanor had entered Clara's small, unheated attic bedroom, not with medicine or soup, but with an apron. Get up, Clara, her mother had commanded, her eyes cold and clinical as she stared down at the shivering girl. This performance of illness is entirely ill-timed. Your sister has a fitting for her ball gown this morning, and I cannot be distracted by your laziness. The mincemeat pies need to be baked, and the silver tea urns must be polished until they are like mirrors. Do not make me regret the day we brought an ungrateful child into this family. Clara had dragged herself out of bed, her limbs shaking so violently she could barely stand. She had worked for 14 hours straight in the suffocating heat of the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon and beef suet making her vertigo spin out of control. When she finally fainted into the flour bin at midnight, the cook had simply revived her with a splash of cold well water and told her to finish the pastry crusts. Now, sitting in the quiet luxury of the first-class cabin, thousands of feet above the Atlantic Ocean, Clara looked down at her hands. They were smooth now, healed by expensive creams and years of living away from the damp drafts of the Cotswolds, but the phantom scars beneath the skin still burned. She had spent the first 20 years of her life believing that if she just worked a little harder, if she just polished the silver a little brighter, if she just stayed up an hour later to iron the tablecloths, the ledger would finally balance. She had thought that one day she would see the debt cleared, and her mother would look at her and say, you have paid enough, you are loved. But the ledger was a lie. The debt was designed to be unpayable. The Whitmores did not want a daughter. They wanted a scullery maid who shared their blood so they wouldn't have to pay her a wage. A quiet, dangerous smile played on Clara's lips as the airplane tilted toward the dark horizon, flying away from the cold country estate that was currently waiting for its servant to arrive through the snow. For 15 years, she had played their game, letting them believe she was still the broken debtor, still the girl who would drop everything to save their vanity. But tonight, the ledger was closing. Tonight, she wasn't just defaulting on the mortgage of their expectations, she was foreclosing on the entire family. The flight attendant gently placed a small porcelain ramekin of warm, roasted nuts on the console beside Clara. The delicate click of the fine bone china against the leather surface, sending an immediate, sickening jolt through her chest. It was the exact sound of a Whitmore afternoon, the high-pitched, fragile chime of wealth that had always signaled the beginning of Clara's deepest humiliations. In the theater of Whitmore Manor, porcelain was not merely material. It was a philosophy, a religion, and Vanessa was its living, breathing deity. The contrast between the two sisters had never been a mere difference of personality or appearance. It was a physical wound, an intentional, slow-bleeding laceration inflicted upon Clara's dignity every single day of her life. Clara leaned back into the shadows of her seat, letting the memory swallow her whole, transporting her back to a specific, bitter afternoon during the Winter Gala of 2015. She could still see Vanessa sitting in the center of the drawing room, positioned precisely where the amber winter sun broke through the leaded glass windows, illuminating her like a saint in a cathedral. Vanessa was draped in emerald velvet, that day a fabric so rich and unforgiving that it seemed to absorb the very light of the room. Her hair was a cascading waterfall of perfect, glossy curls. Her skin was entirely unblemished, pale and pristine, devoid of any mark of effort or strain. She sat upon the damask chaise lounge like a porcelain idol, an object of high art created solely to be admired, coddled, and kept meticulously clean from the dirt of the real world. Eleanor would hover near her golden child, adjusting the collar of Vanessa's gown with fingers that were infinitely tender, fingers that never, not once, touched Clara with anything resembling warmth. Look at her. Eleanor would whisper to the arriving guests, her face radiant with a matriarchal pride that was entirely transactional. Our Vanessa possesses the true Whitmore grace. She is the jewel of this family. She is meant for great things, for salons and high society, not for the common drudgery of life. And while Vanessa practiced the effortless art of being beautiful, Clara was trapped in the subterranean reality that made that beauty possible. Clara remembered walking past the grand, gold-leafed pier mirror in the reception hall that same afternoon, carrying a silver platter laden with 75 crystal flutes of champagne. The reflection that stared back at her was a devastating testament to her erasure. She was 23 then, yet she looked 20 years older, her youth buried beneath the uniform of her subjection. She wore a heavy, shapeless woolen skirt, and a coarse linen apron that was already stained with the gray grease of the duck confit. She had spent 8 hours preparing in the basement kitchen. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, utilitarian knot, held together by cheap bobby pins, and her skin was sallow, coated in a fine patina of sweat and flour. But it was her hands that broke her heart every time she looked at them. Her fingernails were permanently etched with the dark, stubborn soot of the morning hearths she had been forced to clear before the sun had even risen. Her knuckles were red and swollen from the freezing well water she used to rinse the heavy crystal before the guests arrived. She was the shadow that allowed the idol to shine. She was the hidden, ugly engine that drove the magnificent, clean illusion of the Whitmore name. Clara, move along, don't obstruct the mirror. Dear Eleanor had snapped as she walked past, not even looking her in the eye, her hand waving Clara away as if she were a particularly unsightly piece of old furniture. Lord Hetherington's glass is empty. And for heaven's sake, keep your hands hidden beneath the napkin when you pour. The soot under your nails is positively stomach-turning. The words had landed like salt in an open gash, but Clara had simply bowed her head, squeezed the silver platter until her raw fingers went numb, and whispered, yes, mother, That was the cruelest dynamic of the gilded cage. Vanessa was praised for her helplessness, while Clara was despised for her labor. If Vanessa broke a vase, it was an endearing sign of her delicate, fragile nature. If Clara dropped a saucer after working an 18-hour shift, she was berated as an incompetent, clumsy animal who did not appreciate the cost of fine things. Vanessa's life was an endless succession of riding lessons, finishing schools, and boutique shopping trips funded by the estate's dwindling capital, while Clara's life was an endless inventory of chores, bills, and stains that needed to be removed before the world could see them. Clara remembered watching from the kitchen door as Vanessa entertained the guests, laughing melodiously at a joke made by a wealthy shipping magnate. Vanessa didn't know how to boil an egg. She didn't know how the coal arrived in the cellars or how many thousands of pounds the estate owed to the local tradesmen. She didn't have to know. She was the porcelain idol, and idols do not concern themselves with the mud at their pedestals. But what the idol and her worshippers never understood was that porcelain is incredibly fragile. It cannot bear weight. It cannot survive a storm. It exists only because someone else builds the shelf, cleans the glass, and guards the room. For 34 years, Clara had been the unseen pillar holding up the shelf. She had practiced the art of disappearing so perfectly that her family had truly come to believe she was invisible, that the drinks poured themselves, that the silver polished itself, and that the money that kept the roof over their heads materialized out of thin air. Clara opened her eyes in the dim luxury of the aircraft cabin, her gaze falling upon her own hands resting on the armrest. The soot was gone, replaced by the meticulous care of a life she had built completely independent of them, but the memory of that hall mirror remained as sharp as a razor blade. A slow, chilling calmness settled into her chest. Tonight, the idol would be left unprotected in the drawing room. Tonight, the hands that served the drinks and polished the wine glasses were flying across the ocean at 500 miles an hour. Let the porcelain idol try to cook the Christmas goose. Let the queen of the manor try to light the seasoned ash without burning her silk gown. Clara smiled into the dark, a phantom ghost who had finally decided to stop haunting her own home and leave the living to starve in their own beautiful, empty palace. The memory shifted, blurring like ink in water, dragging her mind back to the hours preceding the boarding call, back to the terminal lounge where she had sat before this long ascent. In that vast, high-ceilinged room of glass and structural steel, Clara had watched the heavy flakes of a British winter descend upon the dark tarmac, each white speck melting against the hot exhaust of taxiing jets. Around her, people were frantic checking watches, spilling coffee, arguing with gate agents about delayed connections. But Clara's pulse had been an eerie, unyielding flatline. Her heart was not racing. It was perfectly, terrifyingly still, operating with the cold, mathematical precision of an engine that had finally been calibrated correctly. That stillness had not been born in the airport. It had been forged months earlier, on a grim, rain-slicked Tuesday, in Mid-Autumn, the exact day the silent calculation became an absolute reality. She remembered the scent of that afternoon with agonizing clarity: wet wool, damp dry rot creeping up the wainscoting of the manor's library, and the sour tang of the cheap sherry her father drank when the market indicators were down. Clara had entered the room holding 3 thick leather folders. They contained the fully restructured debt portfolios for Whitmore Timber Supplies, her father's failing enterprise. For 6 months, working late into the night after her family had gone to sleep, she had used her own corporate consulting firm under a meticulously guarded shell name to secretly buy up their high-interest liabilities, refinancing them through private equity she controlled. She had saved him from immediate bankruptcy. She had saved the roof over their heads. She had stood before Richard's heavy mahogany desk, her fingers trembling slightly as she laid the documents down. She hadn't wanted their praise for her wealth. She had simply wanted them to recognize her mind. She had wanted him to look at her and see a brilliant, self-made woman who had mastered the very financial world that was swallowing him whole. Richard had barely glanced at the signatures. He hadn't asked how his failing freelance writer of a daughter had managed to secure terms that the high street banks had denied him for a year. He had simply let out a long, pathetic sigh of relief, slid the folders into a drawer, and adjusted his gold-rimmed spectacles. "Good," he had muttered, already looking past her toward the window where Vanessa's car was pulling up the gravel drive. "This keeps the wolves from the door before the winter season. Your mother was frantic about the budget for the hunt ball. Go up to her room, Clara. She's had a delivery of antique velvet curtains from an estate sale in Wiltshire. They need to be unpicked, cleaned, and rehung in the grand gallery before Friday. And mind the trim. It's fragile." There was no inquiry into how she was sleeping, no curiosity about her life in London, no inkling that she might have dreams that didn't involve the restoration of his property. The realization did not arrive as a sudden, weeping collapse. It came as a silent, devastating revelation. It was the sound of a heavy vault door clicking shut inside her mind. In that moment of crystal clarity, as she stared at the crown of her father's balding head, she understood the absolute truth of her existence in the Whitmore dynasty. They would never look at her and see a human being. They would never see a woman, a daughter, or a soul worthy of protection. To them, she was a utility. She was a household appliance, like the boiler in the cellar, or the range in the kitchen, expected to perform flawlessly, criticized when it broke, but entirely forgotten when it kept the house warm. And with that revelation came a beautiful, terrifying freedom. If they could not see her humanity, they did not own her future. She owed them nothing, not her identity, not her labor, and certainly not the sacrifice of her life. The ledger she had kept in her heart for 34 years was instantly wiped clean, replaced by a cold, clinical strategy for extraction. She had spent the next 6 months executing the silent calculation, treating her family exactly as she would a toxic, parasitic corporate entity that needed to be liquidated without warning. Every interaction from that Tuesday onward had been a calculated performance of compliance designed to keep them blind. When Eleanor demanded she spend her weekends polishing the brasses, Clara did it, using the quiet hours in the long gallery to map out the legal foreclosure parameters of the Whitmore estate on her laptop. When Vanessa bragged about her new diamond tennis bracelet, purchased with a dividend that Clara's secret equity firm had authorized just to keep the family complacent, Clara had smiled and nodded, while simultaneously transferring the primary deed of Whitmore Manor into a non-profit charitable trust under her sole executorship. Each "yes, mother," each "of course, father," had been a silent, elegant stroke of a pen, severing the tethers that bound her to them. She had engineered her departure like a flawless corporate takeover. She had checked the weather patterns, monitored the guest list for the Christmas Eve banquet, and waited until the exact moment when her absence would cause the maximum, unrecoverable collapse of their social machinery. Sitting now in the deep comfort of the first-class cabin, the airplane banking hard over the dark expanse of the Bristol Channel, Clara looked out at the thick blanket of clouds below. The calculation was complete. The equation had balanced itself the moment she handed her boarding pass to the attendant. Back in the Cotswolds, the snow was falling faster, covering the gravel paths, burying the gardens, and sealing the manor in a freezing white tomb. They were currently waiting for their utility to arrive, entirely unaware that the machine had disconnected itself from the wall, packed its bags, and left them to freeze in the dark house they had built upon her back. While Clara's flight climbed effortlessly into the silent stratosphere, 70 miles away, beneath the sagging slate roofs of Whitmore Manor, the atmosphere had degenerated into a frantic, hysterical delirium. The air in the cavernous basement kitchen was thick with the suffocating humidity of boiling copper vats and the heavy, metallic scent of raw game. Outside, the blizzard battered the high iron-barred windows, casting a bleak, flickering gray light across the stone floor. Inside, Eleanor Whitmore moved through the space like a storm deity in winter silk, her emerald green skirts swishing against the table legs with a sharp, rhythmic sound that resembled a threat. "Not those linens, you foolish girl," Eleanor shrieked, her voice echoing off the damp, whitewashed brick walls as she rounded on a terrified 19-year-old seasonal maid from the village. "Those are the everyday mask, I told you, the monogrammed Irish linen, from the cedar chest in the attic. If Lord Hetherington sees a frayed hem on his napkin, I will ensure your family doesn't see a single shilling of timber work from Richard this winter." The girl burst into tears, dropping the stack of fabric and fleeing toward the scullery. Eleanor didn't even watch her go. She checked the heavy gold watch pinned to her lapel, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps of pure panic. It was nearly 5 o'clock. The grand foyer upstairs was already echoing with the heavy, wet thuds of early arrivals stamping the snow from their riding boots. The air of the manor was freezing. The ancient, coal-fired boiler in the basement was groaning under the pressure of 25 radiators, spitting black smoke into the courtyard. "Where is Clara?" Eleanor muttered to herself, her fingers twisting her pearl necklace until her knuckles went white. "She should have been here hours ago. She knows the chestnut stuffing takes half a day to simmer. She knows the marrow bones haven't been cracked." Eleanor stormed toward the massive, black iron Aga cooker, its heavy lids shut tight and freezing cold to the touch. For 30 years, Eleanor had never once turned a dial on that stove. She had never known the exact sequence of dampers and flues required to coax a steady, roasting heat from its stubborn, antique core. She had never needed to know. Every Christmas, every hunt breakfast, every summer gala, the stove had simply magically glowed with life. The copper pans had always been lined with melted butter. The game had always been plucked, trussed, and seasoned to perfection. Eleanor truly believed that this magic was a natural extension of her own administrative brilliance. She genuinely thought that her loud commands, her clipboards, and her absolute authority were the forces that kept Whitmore Manor from sliding into ruin. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that the true engine of the household, the silent, unseen gravity that quietly smoothed over every architectural oversight, balanced the erratic water pressure, paid the local butchers in cash when the estate's credit was rejected, and ensured the champagne was chilled to precisely 4 degrees Celsius, had already checked out. "Richard," Eleanor shouted, her voice ringing up the stone servant's stairs as her husband poked his head through the door. His evening dress collar, only half buttoned, his face pale with a fatigue he couldn't quite mask. "Have you checked the drive again? Is her car coming up the avenue?" "The snow is drifting past the gatehouse," Eleanor, Richard said, his voice flat, his hand trembling as he adjusted his gold spectacles. "The visibility is less than 10 yards. If she's not here by now, she's likely stuck in the village." "She is not stuck, Richard. She is being deliberately, maliciously ungrateful," Eleanor hissed, slamming her clipboard down onto the flour-dusted pastry table. "She knows what this night means for Vanessa. She knows that the Hetheringtons controlled the zoning permits for the new valley development. Vanessa needs this dinner to be absolute perfection to secure her position with them. Clara has always done this, always trying to draw attention to herself by withholding her help until the last possible second. She wants us to beg her." She turned back to the dark kitchen, screaming at the shadows of the empty prep stations, her voice echoing uselessly off the cold, copper gelatin molds hanging from the rafters. She was a queen ruling over a kingdom of ghosts, totally unaware that the daughter she was currently vilifying was the only soul who had ever truly cared to maintain the illusion of their perfection. Clara had not worked for 34 years out of love for the bricks of Whitmore Manor. She had worked because she had been trapped in the desperate, agonizing hope that if she made their lives flawless enough, they would finally look at her and see a daughter. But that hope had died on a rainy Tuesday in autumn. The machinery of her devotion had been dismantled, piece by piece, and packed away into the first-class cabin of a transatlantic flight. Upstairs, the door chime rung a deep, resonant, brass vibration that shook the ceiling dust down onto Eleanor's pristine silk shoulders. The first formal guests had arrived. The Hetheringtons were in the hall, expecting the warmth of a historic estate, the aroma of spiced wine, and the legacy of the Whitmore hospitality. Eleanor smoothed down her skirts, forced her face into a rigid, aristocratic smile, and stepped toward the stairs, leaving the dark, freezing kitchen behind her. She was walking toward her masterpiece, entirely blind to the fact that the canvas was completely empty, the paint had dried, and the artist had already left the theater. The heavy, pressurized door of the Boeing 777 had sealed itself with a dull, pneumatic thud that sounded to Clara like the closing of a bank vault on her former existence. Now, taxiing through the blinding Berkshire flurry, the great iron bird aligned its nose with the dark expanse of the runway. For a few agonizing seconds, the aircraft hung in suspense, a massive monument of metal suspended between two worlds. Then, the engines roared to life. It was a low, guttural, predatory vibration that did not merely sound through the cabin. It resonated directly inside Clara's chest, rattling the cage of her ribs and realigning the rhythm of her heartbeat. The acceleration was sudden and absolute. The immense kinetic force pinned Clara back into her first-class seat, a benevolent weight that felt like the hand of fate pushing her out of the graveyard of her youth. Outside the window, the white, wind-whipped world of Heathrow blurred into a streak of chaotic gray and yellow light. With a final, triumphant surge of mechanical power, the wheels left the tarmac. The heavy shuddering of the landing gear ceased instantly, replaced by the surreal, smooth buoyancy of flight. As the plane banked hard over the glittering sprawl of Greater London, Clara pressed her forehead against the cool plexiglass. Below her, through the fractures in the winter cloud cover, the city lights of her past shrank into insignificance. The sprawling avenues, the historic monuments, and the distant, dark hills of Gloucestershire where Whitmore Manor lay frozen in its own arrogance, they all transformed into tiny, flickering embers of a dying fire she no longer intended to stoke. For 34 years, she had thrown her own youth, her own dreams, and her own sanity into that furnace, trying to keep a cruel family warm. Now, she was letting the ashes grow cold. With every passing second, the altimeter climbed higher, and the invisible suffocating cord of ancestral duty that had bound her to Eleanor's clipboards and Richard's unpaid debts stretched thinner and thinner. It pulled against her soul one last time, a phantom pang of guilt, a conditioned reflex, whispering that she was a monster for leaving them to face the wolves alone. But the aircraft tore through the cloud layer into the clear, starlit ink of the upper atmosphere, and the cord simply snapped. There was no sound, no dramatic internal rupture, only an immediate, overwhelming lightness that filled her lungs until she felt she might float out of her seat. She stared into the dark, infinite horizon of the Atlantic night. Her eyes were wide, clear, and strikingly dry. There were no tears left for the Whitmores. She had wept her final reservoir of sorrow into the kitchen dishwater months ago. In place of the grief, a terrifying, beautiful sensation of absolute autonomy expanded within her. She was a woman who had finally, decisively walked away from the burning ruins of her own life to construct something entirely her own, from the unblemished marble of the future. In the seat beside her, her leather briefcase lay closed, containing the legal deeds, the corporate filings, and the restructuring contracts that would dictate the next 72 hours of her life. She was no longer Clara the maid, the invisible sibling, the convenient scapegoat. As the plane flew deeper into the dark, toward the warm, neon-lit promise of Miami and the multi-million-pound corporate empire she had built in absolute secret, she was finally, undeniably, the architect of her own destiny. Let the manor house fall, let the porcelain idol fracture. Clara was already gone, lost to the sky, and she had no intention of ever coming down. 70 miles away, beneath the heavy frost-bitten eaves of Whitmore Manor, the house exhaled a long, mournful chill that seemed to seep directly out of the flagstones. Downstairs, the grand basement kitchen, the historical engine of the estate, a space that for 3 decades had been a deafening symphony of clattering copper pots, roaring fires, and the frantic sweaty movement of seasonal staffwas trapped in a morbid, unnatural stillness. The air was heavy with the damp, sour scent of stagnant grease and unlit coal. Upon the massive central prep island, a single solitary tea towel lay crumpled like a discarded shroud. The great black iron Aga cooker, the absolute heart of the manor's winter hospitality, stood dark and dead. Its massive iron doors remained freezing to the touch, gaping open into the gloom like the hollow, toothless mouths of open graves, waiting for a feast that would never arrive. Above this frozen tomb, the contrast could not have been more agonizingly grotesque. In the grand drawing room, the elite of the county were arriving in a flurry of aristocratic perfume and expensive wool. Lord and Lady Hetherington swept through the double doors, their heavy sable and mink coats brushing against the deep crimson velvet walls, carrying with them the crisp, arrogant scent of the winter storm. Richard's business associates from the citymen with gold signet rings and predatory grins mingled with local gentry, their voices rising in a haughty, confident murmur beneath the crystal chandeliers. They clinked their empty glasses, their eyes scanning the room for the legendary Whitmore hospitality, fully anticipating the rich aroma of roasting goose, spiced plum pudding, and the elaborate, multi-course feast that had defined this estate for generations. But the air in the drawing room was thin, carrying only the faint, dusty scent of stale potpourri and unlit paraffin candles. The grand hearths, which should have been roaring with seasoned ash to protect Vanessa's cream silk gown, were spitting small, pathetic plumes of cold gray smoke, choked by a backdraft that no one knew how to clear. Eleanor Whitmore stood at the edge of the reception line, her smile fixed upon her face like a rictus mask, her fingers gripping her pearl necklace so tightly the silver clasp bit into her flesh. Every time the heavy oak front door opened to admit another guest, a blast of icy wind tore through the hall, and with it, the suffocating realization that the kitchen below was a void. She had sent the trembling seasonal maid down 3 separate times to check the progress of the hors d'oeuvres, and 3 times the girl had returned with wide, terrified eyes, whispering that the dumbwaiter was empty and the prep tables were bare. "Eleanor, darling," Lady Hetherington murmured, her heavy diamond brooch catching the light as she extended a gloved hand. "The house looks positively historic tonight. But tell me, where is that marvelous aroma we usually encounter at the threshold? I told Julian not to touch a single biscuit at luncheon today, specifically so he could do justice to your daughter's chestnut stuffing." The words landed on Eleanor's chest like a physical blow. The skin beneath her heavy makeup turned an unsightly, mottled gray. A minor technical delay in the lower quarters. "Beatrice," Eleanor forced the lie through her teeth, her voice carrying a brittle, glassy vibration that made several guests nearby turn their heads. The new head chef we retained from London is meticulous to a fault. He refuses to send up the first course until the temperature of the gallery is precisely synchronized with the presentation. You know how these modern culinary artists are." Beside her, Vanessa shifted her weight, the silk of her gown rustling uncomfortably against the damask settee. For all her rehearsed grace, a dark, sharp line of irritation had creased her perfect forehead. "Mother," Vanessa whispered under her breath as Lady Hetherington drifted away toward the punch bowl, "the guests are starting to look at their watches. It's past 7. Where is Clara? This isn't funny anymore. My hands are still raw from the holly wire, and I am not going to sit here and watch my evening be ruined because she's throwing one of her pathetic, attention-seeking tantrums in the village." Eleanor didn't answer her daughter. Instead, she turned her eyes toward the dark, arched doorway that led down to the servants' stairs. A cold, creeping tremor of genuine panic, a sensation she had not felt since the day the family's first major bank line was threatened, rippled through the room. It was the silent, devastating realization that the perfect, gilded facade of the Whitmore Christmas had been utterly hollowed out from within. The stage was set. The audience was waiting. The lights were blindingly bright, but the script was gone, and the theater was completely, irrevocably empty. The grandfather clock in the long gallery struck 7:30. Its heavy brass pendulum swinging with a slow, mocking cadence that seemed to measure the expiration of the family's social credit. The hour for the first course, the delicate consomme of wild mushroom and truffle that Clara usually spent 3 days clarifying, had passed without a sound from the dumbwaiter. Soon, the clock chimed 8, marking the second hour of an unmitigated disaster. Eleanor Whitmore moved through the crowded drawing room like a ghost haunting her own ballroom. Her emerald silk skirts, which had swished so triumphantly an hour ago, now felt heavy, dragging through the air like a wet shroud. Her face was locked in a brittle, terrifying smile that resembled a rictus mask, her teeth bared in an expression of desperate hospitality, while her eyes remained wide, glassy, and entirely hollow. Behind her back, hidden from the predatory gaze of her peers, her hands were trembling so violently that the skin of her knuckles was raw from the frantic friction of her own fingers. She could feel the collective temperature of the room dropping. The high society chatter, once a warm, fluid murmur of laughter and gossip, had turned sharp, segmented, and suspicious. The 25 guests had finished their first glasses of champagne, and now they stood with empty crystal flutes held loosely in their hands, their eyes darting with increasing frequency toward the grand double doors of the dining hall. The catering staff from the village, the line cooks and kitchen porters Eleanor expected to command like an invading general, had completely failed to materialize. She did not know, could not even fathom in her wildest delusions, that a brief, cold email had been dispatched from a corporate domain hours before, signed by a legal entity they didn't recognize, canceling the contract and paying the workers double their wage to stay home with their own families by the fire. To Eleanor, it was simply an incomprehensible betrayal by the lower classes. In the absolute absence of movement from the kitchen, the silence from the lower quarters did not merely exist, it became a physical weight, pressing down upon the drawing room, suffocating the artificial warmth of the house until the crystal pendants on the chandeliers seemed to shiver with the tension. "Eleanor, my dear," muttered Julian. Lord Hetherington, his voice carrying the deep, unhurried arrogance of a man who had never known hunger or delay. He stepped into her path, his gold pocket watch held openly in his palm. "It is nearly 8:15. The storm outside is turning quite vicious, and while your house is undeniably historic, the draft in the west alcove is rather severe. Are we to be favored with dinner before the midnight bells, or is this a modern, metropolitan fasting ritual Richard picked up in the city?" A cruel, suppressed titter of laughter rippled through the small circle of aristocrats standing nearby. Vanessa, standing a few paces away, froze, her glass stopping inches from her crimson lips, her eyes burning with a mixture of rage and profound mortification. "A minor miscommunication with the service, Julian," Eleanor lied, the words catching in her throat like dry sand, her voice so thin and brittle it sounded like glass cracking under a heavy boot. She forced her laughter to sound casual, but it emerged as a sharp, hysterical chirp. "The head of the agency assured me they had dispatched the secondary carriage through the lower valley road. But the snowdrifts near the old mill must have impeded their progress. Richard has already sent word. It is a matter of minutes, nothing more. A brief, rustic interlude to our evening, I assure you." Lord Hetherington did not slide his watch back into his waistcoat. He merely raised a single well-groomed eyebrow, his gaze drifting from Eleanor's sweating forehead down to the cold, empty hearth behind her. "An interlude," he repeated softly, his tone dripping with a quiet, devastating skepticism. "How delightfully bohemian." He turned his back on her, joining his wife in a corner. The moment his shoulder moved away, the polished veneer of polite British society, the unwritten contract that kept these people smiling at each other while sharpening their knives, began to crack across the entire room. The guests exchanged rapid sidelong glances, their eyebrows communicating what their lips were still too well bred to utter. Whispers began to bloom in the corners like toxic winter flowers. The Whitmores, who spent every hour of their lives projecting an aura of effortless, generational abundance, were failing the most elemental test of their class. They were failing to provide. They could not even feed the people they had summoned to admire them. For the first time in their lives, Richard and Eleanor were exposed, stripped of the silent labor that had always covered their nakedness. The air in the drawing room grew thick, no longer smelling of expensive perfume, but of the sharp, sour, and thoroughly modern scent of raw desperation. It was the smell of a sinking ship before the first flare is fired, and every person in the room could taste the salt in the air. The humiliation was no longer a creeping shadow. It was a physical weight crushing the breath out of Richard Whitmore's chest. His pristine white dress collar felt like a noose, choking the air from his throat as he watched Lord Hetherington turn away with that devastating, aristocratic smirk. Richard's face, usually the pale, calculated mask of a city man, flushed a deep, frantic crimson, the color of raw wine spilled across snow. His hands, long, unaccustomed to anything heavier than a fountain pen, shook so violently that he nearly dropped his gold-cased phone as he snatched it from his waistcoat pocket. He needed a victim. He needed a culprit to flay before his guests to salvage the bleeding remains of his reputation. Without a word to his wife or the weeping Vanessa, Richard retreated from the drawing room, his heavy leather shoes striking the parquet floor with a panicked, uneven cadence. He fled down the narrow, dark stone staircase that led into the subterranean belly of the manor, the servants' domain. He expected to find Clara there, perhaps weeping over a burned sauce, or paralyzed by the sheer scale of the 25-person banquet. He prepared the words of fury he would hurl at her, the threats of financial exile he would use to break whatever small rebellion she was staging. But as he burst through the heavy oak door of the lower quarters, the words died in his throat. The kitchen was so deathly silent that the only sound was the frantic, ragged rasp of Richard's own breathing. The air was freezing, the massive stone walls radiating a prehistoric chill that settled into his joints. The long copper pans hung from the rafters like rows of unrung bells, completely motionless. The vast oak prep table, where generations of Whitmore feasts had been butchered and seasoned, was a clean, barren desert of dead wood. There was no smoke, no steam, no scent of butter or bird. Only the terrifying, absolute stillness of an abandoned tomb. "Clara," Richard roared, his voice bouncing off the whitewashed brick walls, sounding hollow and pathetic even to his own ears. "Clara, get out here this instant. Do you have any idea what you are doing upstairs? Your mother is lying to the Hetheringtons, and your sister is in tears. Answer me." The only response was the low, mournful howl of the Cotswold blizzard, rattling the iron bars of the pantry window. A cold sweat broke out along Richard's hairline, freezing instantly in the damp air of the scullery. He looked down at his phone, his thumbs slamming against the glass, hitting the speed dial for the daughter whose name was entered in his contacts not under her own identity, but under a cold, utilitarian shorthand, *home support, *. He pressed the phone to his ear, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. The line did not ring. There was no comforting static of a connection being sought across the miles of winter terrain. Instead, the call connected instantly, and because the acoustics of the empty stone-walled kitchen were so perfect, Richard's hand trembled so much that he accidentally hit the speakerphone button. The voice that emerged did not belong to Clara. It did not carry her soft, apologetic tone, nor the breathless, exhausted cadence of the girl who spent her life rushing to obey their commands. It was a pre-recorded, mechanical, and entirely monotone voice, the synthetic operator of an international network. It spilled out into the freezing gloom of the kitchen, each word crisp, detached, and utterly unyielding, echoing off the empty copper pots like a tolling funeral bell. *, the subscriber you are attempting to reach is currently resting. No further messages can be accepted at this time. Goodbye. The line went dead with a flat, synthetic beep. Richard stood frozen in the center of the dark kitchen, the phone still extended in his trembling palm. The chilling banality of that phrase is currently resting cut through his chest with the force of an ice pick. It was a message devoid of anger, devoid of negotiation, and completely stripped of the family's power to control her. It carried the absolute, unanswerable finality of a grave. In the echo of that electronic recording, the truth finally broke through the thick crust of Richard's arrogance. The daughter they had deemed a permanent fixture of the estate, the servant they believed was entirely replaceable, the invisible woman who existed merely to clear away the debris of their lives, had not simply vanished. She had effectively, deliberately, ceased to exist for them. She had closed the ledger. She had left them alone in the dark house they had built upon her back, and for the first time in 34 years, there was no one left downstairs to hear them scream. Richard stumbled back up the servants' stairs, his knees knocking against the stone steps, the robotic words of Clara's voicemail still echoing in his ears like a curse. As he crossed the threshold into the grand reception hall, the suffocating warmth of the drawing room slammed into his chest, but it offered no comfort. The room was a pressure cooker of aristocratic expectation, and he was running out of steam before he could even catch his breath or find Eleanor to whisper the horrifying news of the empty kitchen. A tall, imposing figure stepped directly into his path, blocking his way to the safety of the parlor. It was Monsieur Laurent, the high-end wine merchant from the local village enclave, a man whose family had supplied the cellars of Gloucestershire's elite for 3 generations. Laurent was not an employee to be commanded. He was a tradesman who understood the precise currency of status. He stood beside a heavy oak sideboard where 2 massive wooden crates of vintage 2010 Bordeaux and expensive champagne sat unopened, the very vintage Eleanor had demanded to pair with the phantom goose. Laurent's arms were crossed over his heavy woolen apron, his eyes sharp, cool, and utterly devoid of festive cheer. "Ah, Monsieur Whitmore," Laurent spoke, his voice carrying a quiet, unyielding weight that sliced clean through the ambient murmur of the nearby guests. "I have been waiting by the gallery for nearly an hour. My delivery men are anxious to return to their families before the roads freeze entirely. I require the settlement for the Christmas cellar order before I can leave the keys to the crates." Richard felt the collective eyes of 3 nearby business men, including Harold Thompson, his primary partner in the city, shift toward him. The air became instantly thin. To a man like Richard, who had spent his entire life projecting an aura of untouchable, multi-generational wealth, to be questioned about money in front of his peers was a fate worse than physical violence. His ego, inflated by decades of unearned privilege and desperate to maintain the pristine illusion of his status, ballooned in a defensive rage. "Really, Laurent," Richard sneered, his voice dropping into that haughty, patronizing register he used to put the lower classes in their place. He forced a dry, arrogant laugh that sounded like dead leaves scraping across concrete. "Do you truly believe the Whitmore name is going to default over a few bottles of fermented grape? We have held an account with your house since my father's time. Your insolence is entirely ill-timed on Christmas Eve. Accounts must be settled. Monsieur Laurent replied, his face completely flat, his eyes fixed on Richard with the terrifying indifference of a man who knew the true state of the Whitmore bank balances better than Richard himself. The terms were explicit for this quarter. Cash or immediate digital transaction. No credit. Harold Thompson leaned slightly closer, his gold signet ring catching the light of the chandelier as he tilted his glass. The pressure was unbearable. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs like a sledgehammer. With a dramatic, sweeping gesture designed to show the room his absolute financial superiority, Richard snatched his sleek, dark, platinum corporate card from his silver-cased wallet. "Fine," Richard snapped, his hand trembling so violently he almost dropped the piece of plastic. "Take it, process the payment, and consider our generational relationship with your establishment permanently dissolved after tonight." Laurent did not blink. He quietly produced a small, handheld digital terminal from his pocket and held it out. Richard slammed the platinum card against the glass scanner. For 2 agonizing, breathless seconds, the machine sat in suspense. The only sound in the immediate circle was the frantic, uneven rasp of Richard's breathing and the low, distant rumble of the blizzard outside. Richard kept his chin held high, his chest puffed out, waiting for the victorious green light that would silence the merchant and restore his masculine pride. The terminal clicked, but it was not the crisp, musical chime of a successful transaction. Instead, a harsh, flat, guttural buzz tore through the small space, a sound so loud it seemed to echo off the gold-leafed ceiling. On the small screen, a single, terrifying word blazed in brutal, stark red: asterisk asterisk declined, asterisk asterisk. Richard's blood turned to absolute ice. The crimson flush on his face evaporated instantly, leaving his skin an unsightly, mottled gray. "A mistake," he whispered, his voice cracking, the polished veneer of his authority fracturing into dust. The terminal is faulty. The storm is interfering with the satellite link. Try it again." "The link is perfect," Monsieur Laurent said, his voice dropping into a register of cold, clinical finality. He did not offer the machine a second time. Instead, with a slow, deliberate movement that carried the absolute weight of a public execution, Laurent reached out his heavy, calloused hand and gripped the edges of the vintage wine crates. He lifted them from the sideboard, turning his back on the patriarch of Whitmore Manor. It was the first hairline fracture in the grand, ancient foundation of their world, a public, unmitigated admission of insolvency delivered in the center of their own drawing room. The businessmen in the circle did not look away. They stared, their eyes wide with a predatory, calculating interest. The illusion of the Whitmore fortune had not just been questioned, it had been shattered on a silver platter. The house was not merely cold. The wealth that built it was officially revealed to be nothing more than an empty, rotting shell. And Richard Whitmore was left standing in the dark, holding a worthless piece of plastic, while his world began to cave in around him. The echo of the merchant's heavy footsteps retreating down the grand corridor carrying the unopened crates of wine felt like the pulling of a foundational brick from the manor's structural core. A thick, suffocating silence pooled in the wake of Richard's public humiliation. The air in the reception hall grew heavy with the unspoken judgments of 25 aristocrats who could smell financial decay across a room. Emily Whitmore, the youngest sister, stood near the velvet-draped entryway, her fingers gripping her crystal glass so tightly that her knuckles matched the stark white of her pearls. She had spent her entire 30 years of life learning that the highest currency in the Whitmore family was appearance. To be flawed was to be exiled, and to be broke was to be dead. Sensing the vultures, the city financiers, the local land barons, and the gossiping wives circling her father's frozen, gray-faced figure, Emily felt a primal, desperate instinct to redirect the blades. She needed a scapegoat. She needed to cast someone into the arena so that the crowd would stop looking at her father's useless piece of plastic. And the target, as it had been since their childhood, was painfully obvious. Emily glided into the largest cluster of guests, her silk train whispering against the parquet floor like dry grass. She leaned toward Lady Beatrice Hetherington, her face contorting into an expression of theatrical, grief-stricken martyrdom, her voice dropping into a low, venomous, yet carefully calculated whisper, designed to carry just far enough across the room. "You must forgive my father, Beatrice," Emily murmured, her eyes wide with a false, glistening moisture. "He is utterly paralyzed by the betrayal. The truth is, we are enduring a most horrific domestic crisis tonight. My sister, Clara. She has always been so deeply unstable. so terribly fragile in her mind. Poor thing. We have given her everything: shelter, patience, our absolute devotion, yet she has harbored this inexplicable, malicious resentment toward our family name. To abandon us tonight, of all nights, knowing how much this gathering meant for Vanessa's prospects. It is an act of pure, unadulterated selfishness. She simply took the keys to the larders and disappeared into the storm to punish us for expecting her to behave like a daughter. The words were precise, dripping with the ancient poison of the Whitmore narrative, the same narrative that had branded Clara as the unstable, ungrateful problem child whenever she tried to claim an inch of her own identity. Emily watched Lady Hetherington's face, waiting for the familiar nod of aristocratic sympathy, waiting for the crowd to join her in flaying the absent martyr. But her words fell into a vast, unyielding void. Lady Hetherington did not blink. She did not offer a comforting pat on Emily's arm or a sigh of condemnation for the rogue daughter. Instead, the old matriarch slowly lowered her empty champagne glass, her gaze drifting past Emily's shoulder to survey the grand room with the cold, clinical assessment of a building inspector. The guests, highly sensitive to the shifting winds of social and financial power, were no longer listening to the Whitmore script. The spell of the family's effortless, generational abundance had been broken by the loud buzz of the declined credit terminal. And now, the guests were seeing the reality they had ignored for years. They were watching the house die. They noticed, for the very first time, the fine patina of gray dust settling into the deep carvings of the gold-leaf cornices. They saw the jagged, unhealed cracks running through the plaster above the grand fireplace, cracks that had been hidden by expensive tapestries that were now suspiciously absent. They looked toward the open double doors of the dining hall and saw nothing but a barren expanse of polished mahogany, devoid of silver, devoid of porcelain, and completely empty of the feast they had been promised. Most damaging of all, they looked at Richard Whitmore, who still stood by the sideboard, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a wild, frantic terror that no amount of aristocratic heritage could conceal. "Is that so, Emily?" Lady Hetherington remarked softly, her tone entirely devoid of pity, carrying only the sharp, analytical edge of a woman who knew when an estate was about to go into receivership. "How very chaotic for you all. Julian, dear, do look at that corn chandler's bill sitting on the hall table. It appears to be stamped with a third reminder." A quiet, devastating murmur rippled through the circle of guests. They turned away from Emily, their shoulders forming a physical wall that excluded her from their conversation. They were already calculating the value of the Whitmore land, wondering who would buy the timber yards when the liquidation began, and debating which of them would inherit the Hetheringtons' favor, now that the Whitmores had proven themselves to be frauds. Emily stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat, her face burning with a sudden, humiliating heat. She looked down at her hands, realizing that her poison had lost its potency. She was no longer a powerful daughter of the gentry defending her family's honor. She was merely a serpent hissing uselessly in the cold, dark ruins of a burning kingdom that was collapsing over her head. And there was no one left in the world who cared to listen to her lies. The social asphyxiation of the room was nearly absolute. The whispers among the 25 guests had settled into a low, expiratory hum, the kind of terrible acoustic that precedes a sudden shift in the tide of power. Emily stood stranded in her own venom. Her sister Vanessa clutched at her emerald silk skirt as if it were a sinking raft, and Richard remained frozen beside the barren sideboard, his platinum card still gripped in his white-knuckled fingers. The silence in the center of the hall had become a deafening, throbbing peak of tension, a pressure so immense that the crystal pendants on the cold chandeliers seemed to tremble from the sheer weight of it. Then, breaking through the suffocating stillness of the manor, the heavy brass door chime rang out. It was a deep, resonant, and shockingly intrusive sound that struck the rafters like an iron fist. The guests shifted, their heads turning in unison toward the grand oak portal of the reception hall. For a fleeting, desperate second, a desperate spark of hope flared in Eleanor's eyes. She smoothed her green velvet dress with a manic, trembling hand, whispering to herself that it must be the secondary carriage, that it must be the caterers arriving with the juniper-brined goose to salvage her life. The massive door was swung open by the shivering young housemaid, admitting a howling blast of the Cotswold blizzard that swept across the parquet floor, causing the candles to flicker and die. But it was not a chef who stepped through the swirling frost. It was a courier, his heavy leather boots caked in gray slush, his bright yellow visibility jacket a garish, modern scar against the historic, dim grandeur of the Whitmore entryway. He was an ordinary man of the working world, utterly unimpressed by the gold-leaf cornices, the ancestral portraits, or the titles of the aristocrats who stared at him with aristocratic disdain. He did not remove his cap. He did not offer a festive greeting. To him, this grand country estate was not a palace of timeless privilege. It was merely an address on a repossession log. Richard Whitmore, the courier's voice, boomed through the hall, flat, nasal, and entirely devoid of deference. Richard swallowed hard, his throat clicking like a dry twig. He couldn't speak. He could only give a small, pathetic nod of his head. The courier stepped forward, his boots leaving wet, muddy tracks across the pristine floor that Clara had spent her life polishing until her knees bled. From his heavy waterproof pouch, he pulled a crisp, stark white, and rigidly sealed legal envelope. It was not adorned with holly or red ribbon. It bore the cold, unmistakable crest of the High Court of Justice and the stamp of London's most ruthless corporate receivers. He did not place it in Richard's hand. With the casual, devastating indifference of a man performing a routine bureaucratic chore, the courier tossed the heavy envelope onto the mahogany sideboard. It landed right beside Richard's useless platinum card with a dull, heavy asterisk thud, asterisk, a sound that echoed through the vast, silent room with the terrifying finality of a judge's gavel striking a block. "Sign here," the courier muttered, holding out a digital clipboard. Richard's hand shook so violently he could barely drag the stylus across the glass screen. The moment the digital signature cleared, the courier turned on his heel and walked out into the storm, slamming the heavy oak door behind him, leaving the Whitmores alone with their executioner. The envelope sat upon the mahogany, its bold, black lettering visible to anyone standing within 5 feet. Lord Julian Hetherington stepped closer, his gold spectacles catching the dim light as he openly read the legal header. A sharp, audible intake of breath rattled in his throat. It was a formal, unappealable notice of impending foreclosure and immediate asset freeze. The document explicitly stated that due to a total, unmitigated default on the primary and secondary mortgages of Whitmore Manor debts that had been quietly bought up, bundled, and called in by a private equity firm listed only as Stellar Holdings *, the family was required to vacate the premises within 28 days. Every account associated with the estate was locked. Every piece of land was seized. The 25 guests watched, utterly mesmerized, their aristocratic facades completely dropping away as the naked, bleeding reality of their host's total ruin was served to them on a silver platter. The silence that followed was no longer polite. It was the cold, clinical silence of an autopsy. They looked at Eleanor, whose mouth was opening and closing in a silent, hysterical scream. They looked at Vanessa, whose cream-silked gown now looked like a shroud for her shattered social ambitions. The grand illusion was dead. The performance was over. The Christmas dinner would never be served, because the very plate they stood upon had been repossessed beneath their feet. The liquidation of the Whitmore dynasty had begun in the center of their own ballroom, and the daughter they had treated as a maid was currently flying 500 miles an hour into the sun, completely unburdened by the debris of the house she had finally brought crashing down upon their heads. The heavy brass-handled mahogany door of the estate study clicked shut with a sound that felt less like privacy and more like the sealing of a tomb. Richard Whitmore turned the iron key in the lock, his fingers slick with a cold, greasy sweat that made the metal slip from his grasp. Outside, in the grand gallery, the muffled, sharp acoustics of 25 panicked aristocrats, gathering their sable coats and demanding their carriages, cut through the air like the cawing of crows over a battlefield. But inside this room, behind 3 inches of reinforced oak and rows of leather-bound law books, the air was stagnant, heavy with the suffocating scent of old parchment, stale pipe tobacco, and the rotting odor of a lifetime of failed ambitions. Richard stumbled toward his desk, his legs moving with the heavy, uncoordinated gait of a man who had survived a catastrophic physical impact. He did not turn on the desk lamp. The only illumination came from the violent, flickering white sheets of lightning from the Cotswold blizzard outside the leaded windows, casting long, monstrous shadows across the Persian rug. He fell into his high-backed leather chair, the very chair where his father and grandfather had sat, presiding over the ancestral wealth of the Whitmore name. With trembling, frantic hands, he drew his personal laptop toward him, the modern glow of the screen illuminating the deep, hollow purple caverns that had formed beneath his eyes over the last 2 hours. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his breath rattling in his throat as he brought up the encrypted offshore ledgers of Whitmore Timber Supplies and the primary family trusts. He desperately prayed to find the usual liquidity, some hidden reservoir of capital, some banking technicality that would explain away the horrific buzz of the declined card and the stark finality of the High Court foreclosure envelope resting on the sideboard outside. He told himself it was a glitch, an error in the digital routing, a seasonal delay in the London clearinghouses. He logged in. The security wheel spun, a tiny, circling white line that seemed to count down the final seconds of his sanity. The screen refreshed. Richard's lungs completely collapsed. His mouth opened in a silent, dry gasp as his eyes scanned the digital spreadsheets. There were no columns of black ink. There were no pending transfers or accessible lines of credit. There were only endless, unyielding rows of stark, hollow zeros, punctuated by the cold, digital red of the word asterisk asterisk voided. Asterisk asterisk. Every primary account had been cleaned out, not by a thief, but by a systematic, entirely legal execution of debt collection. He scrolled frantically, his fingers slamming against the keys so hard a fingernail cracked against the plastic, bleeding onto the spacebar. He traced the transaction histories back through the months, following the breadcrumbs of their survival, looking for the source of the funds that had paid their taxes, their staff, their wine bills, and the massive interest payments on the manor's secondary mortgage for the last 12 years. Every single injection of capital, every single financial miracle that had kept the wolves from the door while he sat in his clubs, in Pall Mall bragging about his investments, had come from a single, anonymous corporate entity, registered in the city, under the name, Stellar Holdings, and the primary signatory, the sole owner of the debt bundles that had just been called in by the High Court, was listed at the bottom of the screen, in a crisp, unembellished digital font. Clara Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer, the mirror of his life, the pristine, polished image of a wealthy patriarch, a man of landed legacy and effortless commercial superiority, did not merely crack. It shattered into thousands of jagged, unrecoverable pieces that tore through his mind like shrapnel. A sickening, physical thud resonated in his stomach, a wave of intense vertigo that made him grip the edges of the desk to keep from falling to the floor. He realized, with the terrifying clarity of a dying man, that for nearly 15 years, he had been nothing more than an aristocrat of air. He had been a hollow king presiding over a crumbling kingdom of paper and dust, entirely sustained by the invisible, phantom support of the very daughter he had never deemed worthy of a single glance. Every bottle of vintage wine he had poured for his wealthy friends, every velvet gown he had purchased for Vanessa, every repair made to the leaking slate roofs of this magnificent manor had not been funded by his financial intellect or his ancestral heritage. It had been a charity case. It had been an act of immense, silent mercy from the girl he had ordered into the freezing kitchen to brine his geese and polish his silver. The assets were long gone. The true Whitmore fortune had died a decade ago in the London markets, and they had been living like parasites on a ghost's grace, fully blind to the fact that the ghost had been holding the knife the entire time. Richard pressed his face into his blood-stained hands, the cold dark of the study wrapping around him like a shroud, as the low, mournful howl of the winter wind outside laughed at the hollow shell of his pride. Outside the locked study, the grand drawing room had descended into a cold, transactional panic. The 25 aristocrats were no longer guests. They were a frantic crowd of clean-shredded socialites, gathering their heavy fur coats with a rustle of expensive silk, and demanding their carriages from the trembling housemaid. Eleanor Whitmore stood frozen near the center of the room, her emerald velvet skirts looking increasingly ridiculous against the dark, freezing void of the manor. Vanessa clutched at her mother's arm, her perfect face ruined by red, blotchy streaks of tears that smeared her expensive mascara down her cheeks. Then, cutting through the low, frantic murmur of aristocratic exit, a sudden, sharp sound echoed from the far corner of the room, the distinct, heavy strike of a silver-headed walking stick against the parquet floor. Thud, thud, The guests paused, their fur capes half-buttoned, as the shadows parted near the velvet chaise lounge. Step by step, Nanny Grace moved into the light of the dying chandeliers. For nearly 15 years, the family had treated the 82-year-old woman as nothing more than a rambling, senile relic of a bygone-era silent fixture wrapped in mothballed shawls, left to fade into the wallpaper while they spoke about her as if she were already dead. They assumed her mind was a fog of forgotten dates and mismatched memories, but as she stepped into the center of the drawing room, her spine straightened with a sudden, terrifying rigidity. She threw back her wool shawl, and when she raised her chin, her eyes, usually milky and distant, were clear, piercing, and burning with a lethal, ancestral fury that struck the collective guilt of the family like a lightning bolt. "Do not bother lying to your guests," Eleanor, Nanny Grace spoke. Her voice did not carry the frail, trembling squeak of old age. It was a resonant, unyielding baritone that cracked through the cold air like a whip. "And do not dare to blame the weather, or the merchants, or the child you drove into the storm." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, her face turning an even deep shade of ghastly gray. "Grace, please," she whispered, her hands fluttering toward her neck in a desperate gesture of social deflection. "You are confused. The medication has made you restless. Let the maid take you back to your quarters." "My quarters are paid for, Eleanor, which is more than can be said for the gown on your back," the old woman hissed, her silver-headed cane pointing directly at Eleanor's chest. She turned her fierce, glittering gaze toward the remaining guests, who stood utterly mesmerized, their predatory curiosity holding them captive at the threshold. "You did not lose your grand fortune to bad luck, Julian," Grace declared, looking directly at Lord Hetherington, her words a sharp, clinical blade of absolute truth cutting through the Whitmore myth. "And Richard did not default because of a glitch in the city. They are bankrupt tonight because the foundation of this entire house was built upon a thefta, generational sin that has finally come." Vanessa let out a small, horrified whimper, but Grace's voice rose higher, drowning out any attempt to silence her. 34 years ago, when my sister Richard's maternal aunt passed away, she did not leave this estate to him," Grace revealed, her gaze sweeping over the cowering Whitmore daughters. "She left a massive, ironclad trust fund totaling £4 million, intended solely for the eldest grandchild, for Clara, a legacy meant to ensure that the girl who worked the hardest would never have to beg for her bread. In a world that uses women up and spits them out, the drawing room went deadly, suffocatingly quiet. The only sound was the distant, violent rattling of the leaded glass windows against the winter gale. But Richard could not bear the thought of a daughter holding the keys to the kingdom," Grace continued, her voice dripping with an ancient, unforgiving scorn. "He and Eleanor used a crooked family lawyer to alter the terms, siphoning that child's inheritance into his own reckless, vain market ventures. They stole her past, and then they turned her into a scullery maid to ensure she would never have the education or the time to look for the papers. They kept her in the kitchen, her hands raw from lye and soot, paying a mortgage of labor for a house they had bought with her stolen blood." Eleanor stumbled backward, her hand striking a crystal vase, sending it crashing to the floor where it shattered into 1,000 insignificant shards. "It was for the family name," she shrieked, her aristocratic composure completely disintegrating into hysteria. "Clara she was plain, she was meant for service. Vanessa was the one who was supposed to carry our legacy." "Your legacy is dust, Eleanor," Nanny Grace said softly, a cold, elegant smile touching her withered lips as she looked down at the shards of crystal. "The senile old woman you ignored in the corner has been keeping a perfect, unforgiving tally of your sins for 3 decades. I watched you take her youth. I watched you give her sister the gold and give Clara the grease. But Clara was never as blind as you prayed she was. She found the original deeds 10 years ago. She didn't scream, she didn't sue, she simply let you spend every single penny of her stolen money until you were entirely dependent on her mercy. And tonight, she closed the ledger." The remaining guests did not say goodbye. They turned and fled into the blinding snow, their faces pale with the realization that they had just witnessed the absolute, historical execution of a family's pride, leaving the Whitmore women alone in the dark with the ghost of the inheritance they had murdered. The devastating echoes of Nanny Grace's revelations still hung in the freezing air of the drawing room, a suffocating smoke that made it impossible to draw a clean breath. The few guests who had not yet crossed the threshold lingered like ghosts, their coats half-buttoned, their eyes wide with a horrific, intoxicating fascination. Vanessa stood near the grand piano, her knuckles white against the polished ebony wood. Her entire identity, the carefully cultivated myth of the flawless, untouchable younger sister who had captured the heart of the city's most promising young developer, was fracturing before her eyes. She turned a desperate, pleading gaze toward her husband, Dylan Cole. Dylan was 39, a man designed for the bright lights of London's high-stakes real estate galleries, with a perfectly tailored wool overcoat and a smile that had always radiated the unyielding confidence of unlimited wealth. For 7 years, Dylan had been the crown jewel of Vanessa's vanity, the living proof that she had won the dynamic race of life while Clara languished in the shadows of the estate kitchen. Then, breaking through the heavy, funereal silence of the hall, Dylan's phone erupted with a frantic, stuttering succession of high-pitched alerts. The sound was sharp, modern, and entirely violent in its intrusion. Dylan snatched the device from his silk-lined pocket, his fingers slick with a sudden, uncharacteristic sweat. As his eyes scanned the luminous display, the polished, aristocratic color drained from his face with the speed of water vanishing down a drain. The confident, condescending line of his jaw collapsed into a loose, trembling ruin. "No," Dylan whispered, his voice a dry, gravelly rasp that barely cleared his throat. "No, this is impossible. The audit wasn't scheduled until the end of January." Vanessa stepped forward, her cream silk gown rustling against the cold parquet floor, her hands reaching out to clutch at his lapels. "Dylan, darling, what is it? Speak to me. Don't let these people see you like this. Tell them, it's just a minor business matter. Tell them, we are fine." He did not look at her. He did not even seem to register the weight of her hands upon his chest. His eyes remained locked on the screen, where 3 consecutive urgent emails from his chief financial officer had just been superseded by a public bulletin from the Financial Conduct Authority. The veneer of their perfect, gilded marriage did not merely crack, it disintegrated into a foul, black ash. Dylan's grand vanity project, the multi-million-pound urban development firm that had been touted by the county newspapers as the rising star of the region's luxury sector, had just been unmasked. It was not a powerhouse of modern commerce. It was a hollow, parasitic house of cards, a meticulously disguised Ponzi scheme that had spent years using the deposits of local land investors to fund his and Vanessa's lavish lifestyle, their winter trips to St. Moritz, and the diamond tennis bracelets she wore like trophies. But the deepest, most lethal twist of the knife was hidden in the red columns of the leaked corporate ledgers currently flashing on his screen. The critical liquidity, the vast, anonymous venture injections that had propped up Dylan's fraud every single time the regulators came knocking over the last 5 years had not come from international investment banks. The capital had been funneled through a series of offshore shell firms traced directly, unalterably, back to a private holding entity controlled by Clara Whitmore. Clara had not been blind to his rot. She had been documenting it. She had been funding his vanity just enough to keep him breathing, accumulating his personal guarantees and fraudulent signatures like iron weights, waiting for the exact day she would withdraw the life support and let the law crush him, with the frozen realization that his leverage was entirely gone, that his bank accounts were frozen, and that the authorities were already en route to his London offices. The man Vanessa thought she owned, transformed into a terrified stranger. Dylan didn't look at his wife's weeping, blotchy face. He didn't look at Eleanor, who was staring at him with a wild, pleading desperation. He didn't look at the family legacy that had patronized him for a decade. He only looked for the exit. "Get off me," Dylan snarled, his arm swinging back with a brutal, clumsy force that sent Vanessa stumbling backward against the piano keys, creating a loud, discordant clash of brass strings that shivered through the room. "Dylan," Vanessa shrieked, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wail as she fell to her knees in the dust. "Dylan, you can't leave me. Not tonight. Not in front of them." He didn't answer her. He didn't give her the mercy of a single backward glance. Dylan turned on his heel, his heavy leather boots striking the floor with a frantic, escaping rhythm as he charged toward the grand front doors. He tore them open, letting in a violent, freezing cascade of the Cotswold blizzard that extinguished the last remaining candles in the hallway, and vanished into the blinding, freezing blackness of the night. He fled like a thief escaping a tomb, abandoning his porcelain idol to drown in the absolute ruin of their shared, shattered deceit. The heavy oak doors groaned against the winter wind, their iron hinges vibrating with a low, mournful frequency that seemed to shrink the grand walls of Whitmore Manor. The vast ceilings, once majestic, now felt like the low, crushing stone of a dungeon. The house was no longer a palace of effortless privilege. It was a cage, a freezing trap of velvet and wrought, and the wolves were already inside. Eleanor Whitmore stood under the dim, flickering light of the final chandelier, her breath coming in ragged, hysterical plumes of white mist. The exit of Dylan Cole had left a gaping, bloody wound in her matriarchal pride. She looked down at Vanessa, who was still sprawled against the piano keys, her cream silk gown stained with the soot of a dying hearth, her perfect cascading curls tangled and matted with tears. The sight of her golden child, the jewel she had polished at the expense of Clara's youth, looking so utterly broken, so pathetically abandoned, triggered a violent, chemical shift inside Eleanor's chest. When pride turns to ash, a narcissist does not seek repentance. They seek a target to flay. "Get up," Eleanor whispered, her voice dropping into a guttural, terrifying hiss that cracked through the freezing air like a whip. She stumbled toward the piano, her emerald silk skirts dragging through the shards of the shattered crystal vase. "Get up, Vanessa. How dare you grovel on the floor like a common kitchen maid? Your husband is a fraud, a thief. He has brought the police to our gates on Christmas Eve. Did you know? Did you know he was using that creature's money to buy your emeralds?" Vanessa let out a sharp, choked sob, her hands covering her face. "I didn't know, Mother. I swear to you, I didn't know anything about the loans. I only knew we needed the liquidity. The boutique in London was threatening to close our account, and the lease on the Mayfair flat was 6 months in arrears." The Mayfair flat. Eleanor froze, her eyes widening with a sudden, predatory suspicion. The temperature in her blood plummeted. "What do you mean the flat was in arrears? Your father gave you £20,000 from the timber dividend in October, specifically to clear those balances." It wasn't enough," Vanessa whimpered, her voice cracking as she pulled herself up against the dark mahogany of the piano, her eyes darting frantically toward the far wall of the drawing room. "The interest, Mother. The debt was too high." Eleanor's gaze followed Vanessa's eyes, landing upon a seamless, gold-leafed wood panel positioned behind the silk-draped chaise lounge. It was the entry to the hidden wall safe, the ancestral vault of the Whitmore women. Within that brick-lined cavity lay the true, undeniable proof of their bloodline: the Victorian sapphire parure, gifted by the Duke of Marlborough, the George III silver soup tureen that had set the table for royalty, and the heavy, solid gold signet boxers that contained 3 generations of unblemished family history. A cold, heavy dread settled into Eleanor's stomach, a weight far more terrifying than the High Court foreclosure notice resting on the sideboard outside. She did not walk toward the panel. She charged it, her fingers tearing at the delicate hidden latch until her expensive manicured nails split and bled against the wood. With a violent pull, the panel swung open, revealing the small, heavy iron door of the safe. The combination lock was already spinning, loose and unlocked. Eleanor yanked the iron handle. The safe door swung open with a dry, scraping screech. Eleanor's lungs completely emptied. A high-pitched, breathless gasp tore from her throat as she stared into the dark interior. There was no velvet lining. There was no blue fire of sapphires, no heavy, cold weight of historic silver. The vault was a barren, dusty desert of empty iron hooks and velvet-lined compartments that held nothing but air and a few stray bits of packing tissue. The parure was gone. The historic silver was gone. The legacy was completely hollowed out. "Where are they?" Eleanor shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch of pure delirium that shook the dust from the rafters. She turned on Vanessa, her hands curling into talons, her face contorted into a monstrous mask of betrayal. "Where is my mother's silver, Vanessa? Where are the Marlborough sapphires? Speak to me before I tear that silk from your back." Vanessa collapsed against the settee, her face turning a ghastly, translucent white as she realized her final, deepest deceit had been exposed to the very woman who had worshipped her. "I had to, Mother," Vanessa screamed back, her aristocratic composure completely shattering into the raw, ugly panic of a common criminal. "The brokers in London were going to repossess the sports car. They were going to tell the papers. I've been taking them out, piece by piece, since the spring. I had a silversmith in Birmingham melt down the tea service. The sapphires. The sapphires were sold to a diamond merchant in Antwerp 6 months ago." The words landed on Eleanor's chest with the physical impact of a sledgehammer. She stumbled backward, her hand clutching at her throat, her chest heaving as the absolute horror of the revelation burned through her veins. The daughter they had pampered, the child they had excused from every chore, the idol they had showcased in the drawing room, while Clara's fingers split open from lie and suit this golden child, had been cannibalizing their legacy from the inside out. While Clara had been secretly buying up their debts to keep the roof over their heads, Vanessa had been systematically stripping the marrow from the family's bones to pay for her vanity, her champagne, and her London clubs. The betrayal was not external, it was domestic. They had bred their own executioner in the light of the parlor, while the savior they despised had been banished to the dark of the scullery. Eleanor looked down at her bloody fingers, then at the empty iron vault, as the low, mocking howl of the winter gale outside filled the hollow halls of the manor with the laughter of their absolute ruin. The screaming from the drawing room cut through the heavy oak door of the study, a shrill, chaotic duet of Eleanor's fury and Vanessa's desperate defense. It sounded distant to Richard, like the muffled noises of a shipwreck heard from the bottom of the sea. He sat paralyzed in the dark, the luminous red glare of the laptop screen reflecting off his damp, gray forehead. The numbers had told him they were broke. The foreclosure notice had told him they were homeless. But the desperate, stubborn merchant instinct within him, the pride of a man who had spent a lifetime believing he was the master of his own fate, refused to accept absolute defeat. There had to be a reserve, a forgotten contingency, a secret layer of insulation that his own father had left behind. With a sudden, frantic burst of physical energy, Richard pushed himself out of the leather chair, his knees buckling slightly as his shoes hit the floorboards. He dragged his heavy, breathless frame toward the far corner of the study, beneath the massive oil portrait of his grandfather, Sir Arthur Whitmore. Dropping to his knees in the dust, his fine woolen trousers tearing slightly against a rogue splinter, Richard frantically ripped back the edge of the heavy Persian rug. There, embedded in the solid stone foundation of the manor's oldest wing, lay a small, heavy iron door, the old floor safe. It was a relic from the 19th century, a vault long ignored because the family had transitioned their wealth to modern digital banking and London brokerages decades ago. Richard had not opened it since his father's funeral in 2008. His fingers, slick with sweat and shaking with a terrifying velocity, gripped the heavy brass combination dial. He closed his eyes, forcing his panicked mind to retrieve the numbers. The date of the estate's founding, a sequence he had been taught to respect as a boy. He spun the wheel. Asterisk left to 12. Right to 34. Left to 8. Asterisk with a heavy, mechanical asterisk clunk asterisk that vibrated up through his wrists. The internal iron deadbolts disengaged. Richard gasped, a frantic prayer slipping through his teeth as he hauled the heavy iron door upward. The hinges shrieked in protest, releasing a musty, suffocating cloud of stagnant air, iron rust, and decaying cedar. He plunged his hand into the dark, hollow cavity, his fingers clawing at the emptiness, expecting to feel the cold. Heavy leather bags of gold sovereigns, the crisp paper of old bank bonds, or the velvet boxes of backup assets his father was rumored to have kept. Instead, his hands struck something solid, flat, and bound in cheap, utilitarian cardboard. There was no money. There were no jewels. There was only a stack of 12 identical black-bound ledger notebooks, piled neatly on top of one another like bricks in a wall. Richard's heart dropped into his stomach, a physical sensation of falling that made his head spin. He grabbed the topmost ledger and dragged it into the gray, flickering light of the winter storm. He opened the cover. The pages inside were not written in the elegant, sweeping copperplate script of his ancestors, nor were they the printed sheets of a professional auditing firm. Every single page was filled with a crisp, tiny, and frighteningly precise handwriting, a hand he recognized with a jolt of pure horror. It was the handwriting of his eldest daughter, Clara. It was not a book of stolen secrets. It was a chronicle of miracles. With a shaking hand, Richard turned the pages, his eyes burning as he scanned the dates, the columns, and the footnotes written in Clara's meticulous hand. The ledger began in 2014, the exact year. Richard had supposedly negotiated a brilliant restructuring of his timber yards with an anonymous investment group from London. Asterisk, October 14, 2014. Asterisk, the ink red, sharp and fading slightly. Asterisk, Whitmore Timber Group current account overdraft reached. £84,000 High Street Bank, prepared to execute asset seizure, transferred £90,000 via Stellar Holdings, secondary account, masked transaction as an institutional line of credit. Father's credit rating preserved. Interest rate set to 0% indefinitely. Asterisk, Richard's breath hitched in his throat. He turned the page, his vision blurring as the dates marched forward through the years. A decade of invisible rescue. Asterisk, September 3, 2017. Vanessa's tuition fees for the finishing academy in Switzerland overdue. University threatened public expulsion. Paid £42,000 directly to the bursar, under the guise of an anonymous alumni scholarship. Vanessa must not know. She requires the illusion of merit to complete her social integration. Asterisk, December 18, 2020. Mother's winter hunt banquet, budget depleted. Local butchers and wine merchants refusing delivery without cash settlement. Settled accounts personally at the village shops, £18,500. Instructed merchants to apologize to mother for the administrative delay, so she would not suffer social embarrassment before the Hetheringtons. Asterisk, June 22, 2023. Roof of the West Wing compromised by rot. Cost of structural slate replacement estimated at £110,000. Father, attempted to take a high-interest loan from a predatory firm, intercepted the loan through Stellar Holdings, absorbed the debt, and hired the contractors under an insurance subsidy pretext. Every single crisis that had threatened to tear the Whitmore name to pieces over the last 12 years, every single moment where Richard had walked into the drawing room puffing out his chest, bragging to his peers about his financial resilience and his extraordinary luck, had been a calculated donation. It had been an act of immense, silent mercy from the very daughter they had banished to the damp drafts of the basement kitchen. She hadn't just saved them once. She had been their life support. She had been the anonymous hand that caught them every time their vanity pushed them over the edge of the cliff. While they were sitting upstairs debating whether her clothes looked too poor for the drawing room, she was sitting in her office in the city, signing the multi-thousand-pound checks that kept the very roof over their heads from collapsing. The realization did not arrive as a gentle understanding. It burned through Richard's ancient aristocratic pride like pure acid. It was a visceral, physical humiliation that made him want to claw at his own skin. Their entire existence, their grand house, their status in the county, the very food they ate, and the velvet gowns they wore, had been a charity case. They were not the proud masters of an ancient estate. They were dependents, beggars living on the crumbs of a ghost's grace, funded entirely by a person they despised and treated like an appliance. And the most terrifying part of the ledger was the final entry, dated exactly 6 months ago, on the day of the midsummer ball. The debt portfolio is now complete. Stellar Holdings controls 100% of the Whitmore liabilities. The family has ceased to generate real revenue. They are consuming my marrow while continuing to look down at my hands. The life support will be disconnected on Christmas Eve. Let them see the true value of the maid. Richard's hands lost their grip, and the black ledger fell back into the dark mouth of the floor safe, its pages fluttering shut. He slumped against the wainscoting, his gold spectacles slipping from his nose and shattering against the stone floor, leaving him blind in the dark room while the howling winter wind outside screamed the truth of his absolute insignificance into the hollow halls of his ruined house. The terrifying, absolute darkness of Christmas Eve finally dissolved, but it brought no deliverance. The morning light of December 25th did not arrive with the soft, golden warmth of a festive dawn. It broke over the Cotswolds like a cold, gray sheet of slate, illuminating the frozen carcass of Whitmore Manor with an unforgiving, clinical white glare. The blizzard had ceased, leaving behind a pristine, suffocating shroud of snow that buried the gravel driveways and choked the grand gardens. Inside, the house was a frozen vault. The radiators were dead, their iron pipes groaning with ice, and the air carried the bitter, flat scent of a hearth that had completely gone out. But the true winter was not outside the windows. It was waiting on the phone lines and the digital screens that connected the manor to the world. With the first hours of the morning, the final, unanswerable blow arrived not with the loud clash of swords, but with the ruthless, lightning-fast efficiency of a modern social execution. The news of Dylan Cole's catastrophic Ponzi scheme, the sudden midnight flight of the prominent young developer, and the formal High Court foreclosure notice pinned to the Whitmore's sideboard had broken through the county's elite circles like a tidal wave. It was an information contagion, spreading through the WhatsApp groups of the local gentry, the encrypted email networks of London's high financiers, and the holiday text threads of every aristocrat who had ever stepped foot inside the estate. The Whitmore name, which for 3 generations had been a pristine badge of untouchable gold, an undisputed synonym for effortless, landed elegance, was instantly transformed into a viral mockery. It became a public spectacle of fraud, betrayal, and catastrophic incompetence. By 9 o'clock, the long, winding country lane that led to the Manor Gates road, usually crowded with the sleek, expensive sports cars and luxury SUVs of festive guests, was jammed with a very different kind of traffic. The village locals, the working-class tradesmen whom Richard had patronized and dismissed for decades, stood shoulder to shoulder with the secondary estate owners. But most devastating of all were the members of the town's elite. The very people who had crowded the drawing room the night before, who had smiled while drinking Clara's champagne, had returned. They did not come to offer blankets or comfort. They stood in clusters along the snow-covered stone walls outside the perimeter, wrapped in their heavy cashmere scarves and tailored wool overcoats, holding porcelain travel mugs of coffee, staring up at the grand Georgian windows with expressions that were a toxic mix of predatory curiosity, deep social satisfaction, and cold, calculated scorn. They were vultures, circling a fresh kill. For years, They had tolerated Eleanor's suffocating snobbery and Richard's condescending lectures on investment stability. Now, they were here to watch the execution. Inside the morning room, Eleanor stood behind the velvet curtains, her fingers clawing at the fabric, her face pressed against the cold glass. Her makeup from the night before was smeared across her gaunt cheeks, and her expensive green silk gown was wrinkled and fouled at the hem. "Look at them," Eleanor whispered, her voice a thin, ragged whistle of pure, unadulterated madness. "Look at them, Richard. That is Lady Beatrice's carriage. She's sitting there, in the back seat, openly pointing her opera glasses at our roof. How dare she? They are laughing at us. We are the Whitmores. We built the church in the valley. We own the timber." Richard did not answer her from the shadows of the sofa. He sat motionless, his head buried in his hands, his broken gold spectacles resting on the table beside him like a discarded monument to his sight. He was entirely hollowed out, his mind still trapped in the dark vault of the floor safe, drowning in the precise handwriting of the daughter who had secretly fed him for 12 years. Vanessa cowered in the corner of the room, her knees pulled to her chest, her phone vibrating continuously against the floorboards like an angry insect. Every vibration was a notification of a cancelled account, a rejected membership from her London clubs, or a public statement from an old friend explicitly distancing themselves from the Cole family name. The social world she had sacrificed her sister's life to conquer had closed its iron gates against her in a single morning. Suddenly, the distinct sound of a camera shutter clicked from the courtyard below, a sharp, mechanical slap that shattered the last remaining glass of their privacy. A local freelance journalist, tipped off by the wine merchant from the village, was openly photographing the muddy tracks Dylan's car had left in the snow, capturing the physical evidence of their undignified collapse for the Boxing Day editions of the national tabloids. The Whitmores were no longer the masters of the manor, the proud gatekeepers of Gloucestershire society. They had been dragged from their thrones and bound to the post in the center of the town square, their nakedness exposed, their secrets laid bare. Their very ruin served as the main attraction in a public execution of their reputation. The house that Clara had built with her stolen blood was officially a public theater of shame, and as the crowd outside continued to grow, the family realized the most terrifying truth of all. There was no one left downstairs to close the curtains, no one left to fight the wolves, and no one left to save them from the blinding, freezing light of their own historic sin. The week between Christmas and the final hours of the year did not pass. It decomposed. The public execution of the Whitmore reputation had transformed the historic avenue leading to the manor into a gauntlet of social exile. By the time December 31st arrived, the vultures outside had vanished, driven away not by mercy, but by the ominous, darkening sky that signaled the descent of a historic meteorological monster. New Year's Eve did not bring the promise of a fresh beginning. It arrived with a vengeful, predatory fury, a black blizzard that slammed into the Cotswolds like an invading army. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun had been utterly extinguished, replaced by a suffocating, bruised twilight. The wind did not merely blow, it shrieked. It battered the great stone facade of Whitmore Manor with a rhythmic, thunderous violence that made the 300-year-old foundations shudder. Up in the high roofscape, the gale tore through the rotting rafters, howling down the unused chimneys and through the broken slates, with an acoustic that sounded horribly like the collective, weeping cries of those the Whitmores had discarded, exploited, and stepped over to maintain their fragile throne. It was the sound of a generational debt screaming to be settled. Inside, the grand house had become a vast, freezing tomb of absolute shadows. The final fracture had occurred at noon. The regional utility company, acting under the ironclad parameters of the High Court asset freeze, had disconnected the main power grid. The sudden, pneumatic silence that followed the loss of electricity was more violent than the storm itself. The ancient, coal-fired boiler in the subterranean belly of the house the machine Clara had personally maintained by spending her weekends covered in black soot gave one final iron-rattling groan and died completely. The pipes throughout the east and west wings began to freeze, the water within them expanding like ice wedges, splitting the antique leadwork with sharp, distant metallic cracks that sounded like pistol shots echoing through the empty galleries. In the center of the grand drawing room, the very stage where they had stood a week prior, drenched in the artificial warmth of crystal chandeliers and expensive perfumes, the family huddled together. They were a pathetic triptych of fallen nobility. Eleanor, Richard, and Vanessa sat on the floor, their backs pressed against the base of the damask settee, stripped of their light, their warmth, and the heavy armor of their vanity. They were shivering violently, wrapped in thinning, useless silk blankets, and decorative velvet drapes they had frantically torn from the morning room windows. The emerald and cream fabrics that had once been symbols of their untouchable status were now nothing more than rags used to keep the frost from stopping their hearts. "Richard," Eleanor whispered, her teeth clicking together with a dry, skeletal sound. Her voice had lost its majestic, commanding resonance. It was a thin, weeping rattle. "Richard, the fireplace in the library is drawing smoke backward. The room is unbreathable. We have to light the seasoned ash here. We have to. My fingers. I can't feel my fingers." Richard did not move to obey her. He lay slumped against the wood paneling, his eyes fixed on the cold, dark void of the fireplace. His hands, long, unaccustomed to anything but the signature of checks, were blue at the nails, covered in a fine layer of gray ash from his failed, desperate attempts to ignite a stack of damp cedar logs, using pages torn from his old bank ledgers. He had burned the records of his wealth just to produce a flame that lasted 3 seconds. "There is no wood, Eleanor," he muttered, his voice flat, broken, and hollowed of all masculine authority. "The wood merchant in the village. He wouldn't even unload the cart at the gate this morning. He looked me in the eye and said the Whitmore name didn't buy coal anymore. He told me to ask the maid for a match." Vanessa let out a low, whimpering sob from beneath a pile of heavy chenille throws. Her face, once a pristine canvas of aristocratic perfection, was gaunt, her skin translucent and sallow under the relentless white glare of the winter lightning that flashed through the uncortained windows. Her phone lay dead on the floor beside her, her useless piece of dark glass. She had spent the last 48 hours dialing every contact in her social registry, begging for a spare room in London, a seat on a train, or a loan from an old admirer. Every single call had encountered the same unyielding, silent wall, a disconnected line, an unreturned message, or the polite, chilling deflection of an assistant stating that their employer was out of the country indefinitely. They were left to feast on the bitter, rotting harvest of their own decades of arrogance. They were no longer the proud, generational masters of Whitmore Manor. They were no longer the arbiters of taste or the rulers of the Countess' social hierarchy. Stripped of the silent, life-saving labor of the daughter they had treated as a piece of scullery machinery, they were revealed to be exactly what they had always been beneath the gold leaf: small, incompetent, and thoroughly helpless parasites. The storm outside reached a deafening crescendo, a sudden blast of wind striking the grand leaded windows with such velocity that one of the historic panes shattered, showering the parquet floor with a sharp rain of glass. A freezing cascade of snow drifted across the room, settling into the intricate carvings of the gold leaf cornices. No one stood up to clear the debris. No one moved to cover the breach. They simply pulled their thinning silk blankets tighter around their shivering frames, staring into the dark tomb of the room like terrified, destitute tenants waiting for an end. They no longer had the wealth, the power, or the right to escape. The grandfather clock in the long gallery did not chime midnight. Its internal gears had frozen at 11 o'clock, leaving the house completely untethered from time. The darkness inside the drawing room was absolute, punctuated only by the periodic, violent white flashes of lightning that illuminated the snow drifting across the floorboards from the broken window pane. Eleanor, Richard, and Vanessa lay huddled in their nest of torn velvet drapes, their breathing shallow and rhythmic, a miserable chorus of survival in a dying house. Then, breaking through the relentless, deafening roar of the winter gale outside, a new sound resonated from the front of the manor. It was not the chaotic, structural splintering of a house giving way to the storm, nor was it the desperate, heavy thud of a neighbor bringing emergency wood. It was a sound of absolute, unyielding order. The heavy iron-mounted oak front doors groaned open, the hinge shrieked against the frost, but it was a controlled movement, pushed back by an intentional hand. A sudden, sharp vacuum of air pulled through the corridors, causing the loose tapestries to slap against the wainscoting, and then, cutting through the hollow silence of the reception hall, came a steady, rhythmic, and perfectly measured sound, the crisp, metallic asterisk, click, click, click asterisk of designer heels, striking the frozen marble floor tiles. Eleanor's eyes snapped open in the dark, her breath catching in her throat with a wet, rattling gasp. She pushed herself up against the settee, her frozen hands clawing at her emerald velvet shroud. "Richard," she croaked, her voice a terrified whisper that barely cleared her lips. "Richard, wake up. Someone is in the hall. It must be the receivers. They've come early. They've come to turn us out into the snow." Richard dragged his heavy, shivering frame upright, his sightless eyes squinting into the gloom of the doorway. Vanessa let out a low, pathetic whimper, pulling the chenille throw over her face as if she could hide from the reality that was marching toward them. The rhythmic clicking grew louder, expanding through the empty galleries, echoing off the gold leaf cornices with the terrifying confidence of a conqueror entering a fallen citadel. The shadows in the arched entryway of the drawing room parted, illuminated by a sudden, brilliant flash of lightning that flooded the foyer behind her. Clara Whitmore stepped across the threshold. The family stared, their lungs completely collapsing in a collective, breathless shock. The woman standing before them was entirely unrecognizable to the eyes that had spent 34 years looking past her. She was not the girl in the grease-stained linen apron, with flour on her hands and soot etched beneath her fingernails. She was not the silent, bowing ghost who once vanished into the damp scullery at a single snap of her mother's fingers. Clara was draped in the impeccable, architectural luxury of a custom charcoal wool overcoat that fell to her ankles, over a structured black silk suit that radiated the quiet, untouchable authority of a multi-million-pound empire. Her hair, usually pinned back with cheap bobby pins, was styled into a sleek, elegant chignon, and her skin, freed from the suffocating humidity of the basement kitchen, was pale, flawless, and completely radiant under the white glare of the storm. She wore no jewelry except for a pair of black pearl earrings that caught the light of the lightning like small drops of frozen night. She was dressed in the sharp, cold, and flawless attire of mourning. She had not come to rescue them. She had come to attend the funeral of the Whitmore name, and her presence was as chilling, as unyielding, and as absolute as the winter gale that continued to howl through the open doors at her back. She stood in the doorway, her leather-gloved hands folded loosely over a dark document folio she held against her waist. She did not look at the broken window, or the ruined furniture, or the pathetic heap of silk blankets on the floor with pity. She surveyed the scene with the detached, clinical evaluation of an executive reviewing a bankrupt warehouse. Clara Eleanor's voice finally broke, a sharp, unhinged shriek that carried the last remaining dregs of her matriarchal arrogance. She tried to stand, but her frozen limbs failed her, and she slid back into the dust, looking up at her eldest daughter with a mixture of raw horror and manic hope. Clara, you came back. Thank God, you came back. Look at what they've done to our house. The utility company, they cut the power. The merchants, they lied about the orders. Vanessa is freezing. Clara, go down to the cellars. The boiler has stopped. Clean the grate and light the coal immediately. We have to show the village we are still here. Clara did not move a single inch. She did not raise her voice, nor did she allow a flicker of anger to cross her pristine, beautiful features. She simply looked down at her mother groveling in the dust, her dark eyes completely empty of hatred, completely empty of love, holding nothing but a vast, terrifying, and absolute indifference. The boiler is dead, Mother, Clara spoke, her voice a low, smooth, and resonant cadence that cut through the roaring wind like a steel blade. And the house is no longer yours to command. The maid has officially left the manor, and the living are left to bury their own dead. The freezing air in the drawing room seemed to solidify around Clara's words, turning the breath of her family into small, frantic plumes of vapor. Eleanor remained frozen on the floor, her hand still extended toward the charcoal hem of her daughter's coat, her mouth open in a mute, horrified gasp. Richard sat slumped against the wainscoting, his blind eyes staring uselessly into the gloom, while Vanessa buried her face deeper into her knees, weeping with a rhythmic, desperate quietness. Clara did not remain standing at the threshold. With a slow, deliberate movement, she unclasped her dark document folio and stepped into the center of the room. Her heels struck the floorboards with that same terrifying, metric precision. Asterisk, click, 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 asterisk as. She walked past the shattered glass of the window, completely unaffected by the sub-zero draft that made her family shiver beneath their velvet rags. She did not yell. She did not scream. When she spoke, her voice was a low, steady, and beautifully resonant baritone that filled the oppressive silence of the manor like the music of an unyielding cello. Let us audit the books, Father, Clara said, her gaze settling upon Richard's broken figure. Since you have spent your life treating our relationship as a commercial transaction, it is only fitting that we review the final inventory before the ledger is closed forever. Richard let out a low, pathetic groan, but Clara did not grant him a pause. She began her accounting, a brutal, cold, and meticulously detailed recitation of the last 15 years, delivered not as an emotional outburst, but as a clinical bankruptcy report of the human soul. We shall begin with the winter of 2011, Clara narrated. her eyes scanning the dark corners of the room, as if she could see the timeline etched into the wood. The year I graduated with first-class honors in economics from London. I had received an offer for an internship at a major merchant bank in the city, the first real door that had ever opened for me. But you, Mother, decided that a daughter's career was a secondary concern when compared to the deportment of the family estate. You told me that family came first. You informed me that Vanessa required an 18-month tour of the Italian salons to perfect her accent, and that my duty was to return to the Cotswolds to manage the domestic accounts and handle the kitchen so you wouldn't have to hire a housekeeper. Clara, please, Eleanor whimpered, her teeth clicking together. We did it for your own protection. You were always so plain, so unsuited for the public world. Do not interrupt the auditor, Mother, Clara said softly, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, lethal sharpness that cut Eleanor's defense clean from her throat. That was the first asset liquidated, my youth. I spent that entire winter in a subterranean office with damp walls, balancing the invoices for your vanity while my peers were building their names in London. You took my degree and used it to scrape the grease from your ovens. She turned her gaze toward Vanessa, who shivered beneath her pile of stolen Then came the spring of 2015, Clara continued, her voice never rising above that calm, devastating cadence. The year of the midsummer hunt ball. I had spent 4 months quietly drafting a business proposal for a regional logistics firm, the early blueprint of what would become my primary company. I needed a microloan of £5,000 to secure the office lease. I came to you, Father, in your library. You didn't even look up from your hunting journals. You told me that capital could not be wasted on a girl's commercial fantasies. Yet, that very afternoon, you authorized a check for £6,000 to purchase a custom hand-engraved side-by-side shotgun for Dylan, simply because he had been invited to shoot at a duke's estate and you didn't want him to look middle-class. Vanessa let out a choked, sobbing whine. Clara, I didn't know. I didn't ask for that. You wore the dividends of my rejection like jewelry. Vanessa, Clara countered, her voice dropping into a register of absolute, unanswerable certainty. Every holiday for 15 years was a systematic extraction of my life. Every Christmas Eve, while you sat in your velvet gowns drinking champagne and collecting the compliments of the county, I stood in a kitchen that smelled of suet and blood, my fingers split open from lye, my lungs burning from the coal smoke, ensuring that your performance of nobility went uninterrupted. You bartered my dreams to pay for your reputation. You took every joy, every ambition, every ounce of strength I possessed, and you burned it in the hearth just to keep your fragile, pathetic egos warm for an evening. It was a terrifying execution of their self-deception. With every factual date she cited, with every specific sum of money and stolen days she listed, Clara was stripping away the protective layers of their historical lies. She was forcing them to see that they were not an old, dignified family fallen on hard times. They were thieves who had spent a decade and a half consuming the flesh of their own blood to maintain a gilded, hollow lie. You treated me as an appliance, Clara concluded, standing over her mother's collapsed form, her silhouette towering against the white flashes of the winter storm outside. A utility meant to absorb your dirt and produce your comfort without ever demanding a name or a wage. But an inventory must balance, Mother. You liquidated my humanity to fund your arrogance, and tonight, the supply has officially run out. There is nothing left in the warehouse for you to take. The echoes of the cold, clinical inventory she had just delivered faded into the corners of the cavernous drawing room, leaving only the sound of the freezing Cotswold gale tearing through the fractured glass pane. Eleanor sat paralyzed, her hands tightly gripping the ruined green velvet of her dress, her breathing reduced to shallow, terrified gasps. Richard remained motionless, slumped in the shadows like a collapsed marble monument, while Vanessa's silent weeping pattern broke into occasional, ragged catches of breath. Clara looked at them, her expression entirely unmoving, her features as sharp and elegant as ice carved by a steady hand. She reached down into the dark, unstructured interior of her leather satchel and withdrew a heavy midnight black folder, bound in top-grain calfskin and sealed with a heavy, polished silver clasp. This was not a request for an audience. It was not a grand opening for family mediation, nor a desperate plea for a deathbed reconciliation she had never earned. It was the absolute, unanswerable final act of a corporate and domestic liquidation that had been calculated down to the very second. You believed I simply packed my bags and ran away into the winter night because my feelings were bruised, Mother. Clara spoke, her voice falling through the cold air, with the smooth, heavy resonance of a marble slab sliding into place. You truly believed that after 15 years of being your scullery ghost, my grand rebellion would consist of nothing more than shedding tears in a London flat while you looked for a new servant. You forgot that I am a mathematician by trade, and you forgot that in the commercial world you so thoroughly looked down upon. Failures are not forgotten, they are packaged, traded, and sold to the highest bidder. She stepped toward the center of the room, where a massive scarred mahogany table stood between the damp sofas. The table was an heirloom, once polished to a mirror shine by Clara's own bleeding fingers, now covered in a fine glaze of wind-blown frost and gray dust. With a single, fluid movement of her gloved hand, Clara unclasped the silver lock of the folder and dropped the heavy stack of thick, cream-colored vellum documents onto the wood. The papers landed with a dull, heavy thud that shivered through the floorboards, sounding precisely like the drop of a guillotine blade in the silence of an execution square. I did not merely walk away from Whitmore Manor, Clara whispered, her dark eyes tracking the white sheets of winter lightning that flashed behind her silhouette. For 7 years, every single time your timber supply business collapsed due to your archaic management, every single time your London broker threatened to liquidate your personal holdings, and every single time the interest on the manor's primary mortgage defaulted, I did not just watch, I bought. Richard's head snapped upward in the dark, his blind, spectacleless eyes widening with a sudden, primitive terror. Clara, he rasped, his voice a dry, rattling whisper that barely cleared his throat. What have you done? I accumulated your failures like currency, father, Clara answered, her voice dropping into a register of absolute, terrifying serenity. Every bad investment Dylan made, every debt Vanessa accrued at her London dressmakers, every third reminder from the village corn chandler, purchased them all through subsidiary entities controlled by my firm. I bundled your incompetence into an ironclad debt portfolio. I bought the secondary titles to the Valley land. I bought the outstanding liens on the ancestral portraits. And 3 months ago, I acquired the primary mortgage deed of this very house from the High Street Bank that was preparing to auction it. Eleanor let out a sharp, choked shriek, her body shaking so violently that her pearls rattled against her collarbone. She lunged forward on her knees, her hands catching the edge of the mahogany table, staring at the thick stack of legal contracts as if they were a nest of vipers. No, Eleanor screamed, her voice reaching a frantic, unhinged pitch that cracked against the high ceiling. This is our house. It belongs to the Whitmores. It has been in your father's family since the time of George III. You cannot buy our bloodline, Clara. You cannot buy our name. Your name does not pay the interest. Mother, Clara countered, her tone entirely devoid of anger, holding only the chilling, unyielding finality of a high court verdict. Look at the signatures on the deeds. Look at the seals of the receivers. As of midnight tonight, the Whitmore name owns nothing but the clothes on your shivering backs. I own the roof that fails to shelter you from the blizzard. I own the dark iron hearths that refuse to warm your fingers. I own the stone flagstones you are currently kneeling upon, and I own the very dirt beneath this foundation. She leaned slightly forward, her shadow expanding across the table until it completely swallowed the 3 broken figures huddled on the floor. In that brilliant, frozen flash of the New Year's storm, the ancient order of the house was permanently, elegantly inverted. She had spent 34 years being the child who begged for a crumb of their approval, the invisible debtor paying a mortgage of labor she had never signed for. But tonight, through the quiet, ruthless deployment of her own intellect, the roles had been stripped away forever. She had become the bank that held their lives, the landlord who controlled their shelter, and the absolute, unappealable judge who would dictate exactly how their ruin would end. The heavy cream vellum papers remained still upon the frosted mahogany table, a physical boundary line that separated the past from a cold, unyielding reality. Eleanor Whitmore looked at the seals of the receivers, her eyes wide and bloodshot, tracking the stark black ink of her eldest daughter's signature. The realization that her very shelter was now an act of charity from the child she had spent 34 years erasing did not break her heart, it shattered her optics. With a wet, undignified groan, Eleanor's strength evaporated. She collapsed fully onto the flagstones, her gaunt, wrinkled face pressed dangerously close to the stone grit. Her emerald silk skirts, which had once been a sweeping statement of county dominance, pooled around her shivering frame in the dust like a discarded theater curtain. She began to crawl. It was a slow, agonizing movement, her jeweled fingers clawing at the dust, dragging her knees through the debris of the broken window pane until she reached the sharp edge of Clara's tailored charcoal coat. She reached out, her fingers trembling with a frantic, rhythmic spasm, and gripped the clean wool of Clara's hem. Clara, listen to me," Eleanor whimpered, her voice a thin, raspy whistle that carried no maternal warmth, only the raw, biological panic of a creature stripped of its plumage. "You cannot do this to the family. Think of the Hetheringtons. They are already speaking to the village council. If the bailiffs arrive at the main gates in January, the entire county will know. We will be barred from the New Year's registry. We won't be invited to the winter hunting assembly. Clara, please, you must reverse the filing. You have the money. You can simply hide the deeds in the trust. No one has to know we defaulted." Clara stood perfectly upright, her body as rigid as a marble column in a cathedral. She did not pull her coat away, nor did she look down into the weeping ruin of her mother's face with a single shred of vindication. She watched the clawing fingers with the cold, analytical gaze of an investor observing a dying stock. The absolute tragedy of the moment was that Eleanor's desperation was entirely devoid of repentance. She was not weeping for the decades she had stolen from Clara's youth. She was not begging for forgiveness for the lie-burnt hands, the forgotten birthdays, or the cold attic room where her eldest daughter had shivered through 30 winters. Her tears were not prayers for the restoration of her family. They were pathetic, transactional whimpers for the restoration of her throne. She was mourning her vanity. She was begging for the return of the illusion, the hollow, gilded lie of effortless aristocratic superiority that defined her very right to breathe. "We can fix this," Eleanor continued to ramble, her grip tightening on the charcoal wool, her voice rising into a sharp, unhinged crescendo that cracked against the rafters. "We can tell the papers it was a corporate merger. Vanessa can still marry into the shipping family if we keep the manor titles clear. You can stay in London, Clara. We will give you an official seat on the estate board. We will acknowledge your consultancy. Just give us back the keys. Child, give me back my house." Beside her, Vanessa turned her head away into the velvet cushions, her shoulders shaking with a fresh wave of silent, burning mortification as she listened to the raw, ugly nakedness of her mother's greed. Richard merely buried his face deeper into his blue-tinged fingers, the absolute silence from his corner proving that he, at least, understood that the woman standing before them was completely beyond the reach of their manipulation. Clara looked down at the hand twisting her hem. For 30 years, she had been trained to react to this voice with immediate, frantic compliance, always believing that if she just mended one more linen sheet or balanced one more toxic bank account, the woman kneeling before her would finally open her arms and say, "Asterisk, you are my daughter." Asterisk, but that girl had died on a rainy Tuesday in autumn. The woman who stood in her place was an architect of cold iron and unyielding stone, completely immune to the theater of ancestral guilt. "You still do not see me, Mother," Clara spoke, her voice dropping into a register of quiet, terrifying serenity that cut through Eleanor's hysterical pleading like a frost-tipped blade. "Even now, with the flagstones freezing beneath your knees, you look at me and see nothing but an instrument, a checkbook to buy your silver back, a scullery ghost to clear away the debris of your failures so you can sit at the high table with the Hetheringtons again." With a slow, deliberate movement that carried the absolute weight of a permanent eviction, Clara reached down, her gloved fingers gripping her mother's wrist. Without an ounce of heat or anger, she uncurled Eleanor's frantic fingers from the wool of her coat and dropped the old woman's hand back into the dust. "The theater is dark, Eleanor," Clara whispered, her dark eyes reflecting the white flash of the New Year's lightning. "The martyr has left the stage, and she has no intention of ever playing the part of your savior again. If you want bread, you must learn to bake it yourself." The weight of Clara's final words hung in the freezing air like ice crystals, refusing to settle. Eleanor remained on her knees, her hand resting where it had been dropped into the dust, her gaunt face twisted into a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. Her mind, conditioned by a lifetime of absolute social dominance, could not process a reality where her commands were merely noise and her distress was entirely irrelevant. Clara stood perfectly still, looking down at the broken matriarch, her posture silhouetted against the stark, violent flashes of the winter gale outside. Her features were completely unmoved. There was no sudden flare of triumphant hatred in her dark eyes, no curling of her lips in satisfying vengeance, nor even the flush of residual anger that usually accompanies a long-awaited confrontation. Hatred and vengeance, after all, were still attachments. They were still forms of investments in the Whitmore name fires that required the fuel of emotional capital to stay alive. But Clara had pulled all her investments months ago. Instead, her face held only the detached, clinical gaze of a master surgeon who had just successfully excised a massive, malignant tumor from a patient's chest. She looked at the flesh that had once sought to consume her, noted its decay, and felt nothing but the quiet, sterile peace of a job completed. She watched their escalating hysteria, Eleanor's ragged gasps, Vanessa's desperate, muffled sobbing against the piano keys, and Richard's hollow, unmoving silence in the corner with a chilling, absolute indifference that cut through the drawing room far deeper than any weapon of fury could have managed. To Clara, their tears were no longer the devastating weapons of maternal guilt that had controlled her youth. They were merely salt water, spilling onto the repossessed parquet floorboards. Their frantic lamentations, their pleas for the restoration of their status, and their theatrical displays of grief were just empty noise bouncing off the stone walls of a house that had already been cleared of all life and purpose. The ancestral magic of Whitmore Manor had not just failed. It had been completely dismantled, piece by piece, ledger by ledger, until only the structural rot remained. For the first time in 34 agonizing years, Clara Whitmore looked at the people who had defined the boundaries of her cage, and she saw them with absolute, unclouded clarity. She saw them exactly as they were beneath the borrowed silver, the stolen trusts, and the thinning green silk blankets. They were not the grand, historic titans of the county. They were not the untouchable arbiters of taste and class. They were small, they were desperate, they were utterly, entirely insignificant. They were nothing more than 3 freezing, incompetent tenants lingering in a dark room, waiting for the bailiffs to arrive at the turn of the month. Clara adjusted her charcoal wool coat, her gloved fingers smoothing the fabric where her mother's hand had just been, her internal equilibrium completely undisturbed by the ruins of the kingdom falling around her ears. The cord had snapped, the sky was clear, and the people who had tried to bury her in the dark were finally left to drown in it alone. The final audit was complete. Clara turned her back on the drawing room, her heels pivoting on the dusty parquet, with a sharp, clinical snap that signaled the formal closing of the ledger. She did not grant the broken figures huddled by the settee the mercy of a final glance. She did not look back to see Eleanor slumping into the silk rags, nor Vanessa shivering against the silent piano, nor Richard staring blankly into the dark hearth. To look back was to acknowledge that they still held some fragment of power over her soul, and Clara was already a universe away. She marched into the grand reception foyer, where the heavy oak doors loomed before her, framed by the white, flashing fury of the Cotswold storm outside. They no longer felt like the gates of a prison she had been forced to maintain, but like a grand threshold leading directly into a vast, unblemished world of her own making. As her gloved hand settled upon the cold iron handle of the front door, Clara paused beside the concealed service panel embedded in the stone wall, the central nerve center of the manor's infrastructure. She reached out, her fingers catching the heavy, industrial handle of the main circuit breaker. This was the final mechanism of her control, the ultimate line of life support she had personally funded and protected for over a decade. With a slow, deliberate, and downward pull, Clara disengaged the switch. A heavy, metallic clunk shuddered through the stone foundations of the house. Instantly, the faint, ambient electrical hum that had always run through the belly of the manor, the artificial heartbeat that kept the security arrays flickering, the backup lines pulsing, and the emergency hall lights glowing, faded into a sudden, deathly silence. The few remaining amber bulbs in the chandeliers dimmed, flickered violently against the frost, and then died entirely. The darkness that slammed into the house was total, heavy, and absolute. It was a freezing, hollow void that poured into the rooms like black water, mirroring with terrifying precision the exact spiritual emptiness the Whitmores had created in their own hearts through 34 years of cruelty and arrogance. Clara pushed the massive oak doors open. A violent cascade of the midnight blizzard swept over her, catching the hem of her charcoal wool coat, but she did not flinch against the sting of the ice. She stepped out into the pristine, wind-whipped snow of the driveway, where the sleek, dark silhouette of her chauffeured sedan sat idling in the dark, its headlights cutting twin blades of brilliant white through the storm. The heavy doors groaned shut behind her, clicking into place with the finality of an iron vault sealing a tomb. Clara settled into the warm leather sanctuary of the back seat, her eyes fixed forward on the dark, winding road that would lead her to the London airports, to the warm neon promise of Miami, and to the boundless future she had built with her own brilliant hands. Behind her, in the freezing dark of the hills, Whitmore Manor vanished into the black belly of the storm, its lights permanently extinguished, its name ruined, and its masterless ghosts left to freeze in the wreckage of their own undone kingdom. The exhaust of the luxury sedan left a faint, dissipating plume of heat in the frozen driveway before it, too, was swallowed by the sub-zero air. Inside the car, the digital clock on the dashboard quietly rolled over, marking the official arrival of the new year. Inside Whitmore Manor, the silence that followed the final click of the circuit breaker was not merely the absence of sound. It was an aggressive, predatory entity. The sudden drop in voltage had severed the house from the last illusion of the modern world. Without the faint, mechanical vibration of the electricity, the cold stone walls seemed to lean inward, compressing the vast, dark volume of the drawing room until the air itself felt heavy enough to suffocate. Eleanor remained motionless on her knees, her hands buried in the soot that had drifted across the floorboards. In the absolute blackness, she could no longer see the cream vellum papers resting on the mahogany table, but the image of Clara's precise signature remained burned into her retinas like a scar. For 34 years, her identity had been sustained by the constant, visual validation of her surroundings, the reflection of her status in the polished silver, the deference of the local gentry, the absolute compliance of the domestic staff. Now, with the lights extinguished and the mirrors turned to shadow, she was confronted with the terrifying realization that without her audience, she didn't know how to exist. "Richard," she whispered into the dark, her voice stripping down to a raw, frightened gasp. "Richard, where are you? Touch my hand. I can't find the settee." From the far corner, no answer came. Richard sat locked in the paralysis of a man who had watched his entire life ledger balance out to zero. The darkness had granted him a twisted kind of mercy, hiding his ruined clothing and his broken spectacles from view. But it could not quiet the mechanical replay of Clara's inventory echoing through his brain. He could hear every figure, every date, every hidden bailout he had arrogantly claimed as his own financial genius. The cold was settling into his chest, a heavy, fluid ache that made every breath a reminder of his absolute, unmitigated dependence on the child he had cast out. Vanessa was the only one who didn't call out into the void. She lay curled beneath the thinning velvet drapes, her eyes wide open in the dark, staring at the exact spot where the piano keys had just been. The finality of Dylan's flight and the exposure of her own systematic theft of the family heirlooms had left her completely naked. She had spent her youth believing she was the architect of her own brilliant future, the golden daughter who deserved the world's worship. But as the freezing wind whistled through the broken glass pane, dropping a fresh shroud of snow across her exposed ankles, she understood the brutal truth. She was merely a parasite that had starved its host, and the host had finally walked away. The storm outside began to lose its rhythmic fury, the vengeful gale shifting into a low, mournful drone that sounded like a funeral dirge for the dying estate. The hairline fractures in the plaster above the hearth groaned as the moisture within them turned to solid ice. The Whitmores were left entirely alone in the tomb they had built with their own hands. There would be no frantic dawn preparations for a holiday brunch, no delivery wagons arriving with wood or wine, and no legal reprieves from the London courts. The house was dead, the lineage was hollowed out, and as the final hours of the winter night dragged on toward the cold reality of January, the three figures in the dark could do nothing but listen to the steady, unyielding sound of the frost creeping across the floorboards, claiming the last remaining warmth of a kingdom that had officially ceased to exist. When the first weeks of January arrived, the Cotswold snow did not melt. It hardened into a thick, crystalline crust that sealed Whitmore Manor away from the living world. The grand estate, which had for generations stood as a beacon of unassailable privilege, had transformed into a mausoleum of cold marble and gilded wrought. The high, vaulted ceilings that once amplified the laughter of kings and financiers now only held the stagnant air of an undisturbed crypt. The moisture inside the unheated rooms froze within the walls, causing the antique damask wallpaper to peel away in long, damp strips that hung from the plaster like shedding skin. The world outside, highly sensitive to the sudden, violent shift in social gravity, had recoiled with a terrifying, unified efficiency. The grand iron gates at the edge of the property were now chained and locked from the outside, bearing the cold, plasticized warning notices of the High Court receivers. The Daily Post, which had once flooded the vestibule with cream-colored invitations to hunting galas, charity auctions, and exclusive London registries, had completely ceased. In their place sat only the crushing, suffocating weight of social contagion. The Whitmores were no longer a family to be envied or placated. They were a biological hazard. To speak their name in the county parlors was to invite suspicion. To offer them shelter was to invite financial ruin. Inside the freezing carcass of the house, the family remained trapped. They were not held captive by locks or bars, but by the absolute, paralyzed isolation of the condemned. They wandered through the dark galleries like ghosts that had forgotten how to cross over, trapped within the towering walls of an opulence that no longer held any transactional value. The French ormolu clocks had stopped, the gold leaf on the cornices was flaking off into the drafty air, and the vast mahogany tables stood as barren monuments to feasts that would never return. They were isolated, not by physical distance, but by the foul, inescapable stench of their own public failure. Eleanor spent her days in the morning room, her fingers wrapped in dirty wool rags as she stared through the frosted windows at the empty driveway, her mind perpetually listening for the phantom sound of a carriage that would never arrive. Richard sat in the dark library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes he could no longer see, his hands tracing the cold, empty spaces of his desk where his authority had once resided. Vanessa lay in her room, staring at the ceiling, her beauty rapidly evaporating under the grim, relentless weight of her new reality. They were still inside the palace, but the palace was a tomb. They were left to reign over an empire of nothing but dust, broken glass, and the hollow, mocking echoes of a name that had finally been erased from the ledger of the world. The dark, twisting corridors of the manor's upper wing had become a labyrinth of absolute desolation. The cold had settled so deeply into the floorboards that every step Vanessa took sent a sharp, agonizing ache through the soles of her feet. She did not care. Driven by a manic, hyperventilating energy, she stalked through the shadows like a caged animal, her breath escaping in ragged, white plumes. Her dead phone had finally been revived by a small, portable battery pack she had found buried in a travel case, the very last source of power in the entire house. She held the glowing screen to her face, her eyes bloodshot and wide with a terrifying, unhinged desperation. Her fingers, stiff and blue at the joints, frantically tapped the glass, dialing number after number from her extensive, gold-plated social registry. "Hello, Charles, is that you?" Vanessa's voice, which had for a decade been a haughty, slow, and demanding instrument designed to put peers and servants in their place, was now reduced to a shrill, cracking plea. She gripped the handset so tightly the plastic creaked. "Charles, please don't hang up. I know what the London papers are saying about Dylan, but it's a lie. It is all a monstrous misunderstanding, a temporary liquidity setback. I swear to you, we just need a minor bridging loan. Just enough to clear the primary title on the West Wing. 2 weeks, Charles. 1 week, Charles." On the other end, there was a long, heavy pause. When the voice returned, it carried no warmth, no memory of the shared summers in St. Tropez, and absolutely no pity. "Do not call this number again, Vanessa," the man replied, his tone as flat and clinical as a coroner's report. "My compliance department has already flagged your family's accounts. Any association with the Cole or Whitmore names is a liability my firm cannot afford. Goodbye. Click. The sharp, final snap of the disconnected line vibrated through Vanessa's ear, like a physical blow. "No, no, no," she shrieked, her thumb slamming against the screen to dial another number. She called Julian Hetherington's youngest daughter. She called her boutique contact in Mayfair. She called the girls she had gone to school with in Switzerland, the women who had envied her wedding, the women who had praised her taste. "Beatrice, darling, it's Vanessa, I'm in Gloucestershire. The storm has caused an administrative error with our banking routing. I just need a car sent. Just a car to take me to the station. The Hetherington family is no longer at liberty to discuss these matters with you." Vanessa, a cold, unfamiliar secretary's voice, cut her off before Beatrice could even take the phone. "Please direct all future correspondence to our legal counsel in Bristol. Click. With every successive call, the responses grew shorter, sharper, and more devastatingly detached. The very elite who had once crowded her drawing room, who had flattered her vanity and courted her favor for an invitation to the manor's seasonal balls, had moved on with a brutal, collective amnesia. They did not hate the Whitmores, they simply did not recognize their existence anymore. To the aristocracy, a fallen house was not a tragedy to be mourned, it was a nonentity, a shadow that had evaporated into the fog. Vanessa finally stopped walking. She collapsed against the cold, peeling wallpaper of the gallery, the phone slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto the frost-rimed floor. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening. It was not merely the quiet of an empty house. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of absolute irrelevance. The world outside was continuing its dance. The London clubs were open, the hunting parties were assembling in the valley, and the shipping families were hosting their New Year galas, but the Whitmores were no longer part of the equation. They had been erased from the social registry of the living, left to rot in the dark corridors of a tomb that no longer had a voice to answer their screams. The final legal mechanisms of Stellar Holdings did not wait for the Whitmores to process their grief. As January bled into February, the ironclad parameters of Clara's trust engaged with an unstoppable institutional momentum. The High Court bailiffs arrived not to board up the windows, but to execute a total, revolutionary transformation of the estate. The name Whitmore was permanently struck from the stone gateposts, chiseled away by masonry tools until nothing remained but raw, unblemished limestone. The manor was stripped entirely of its toxic pretensions. Under the explicit, unyielding terms of the new charitable trust, the massive oak front doors were flung wide to the world, not for the preening aristocracy, nor the predatory city financiers who had watched the house die, but for the very people the Whitmores had spent a lifetime stepping over. The grand drawing room, where Eleanor had once measured a person's humanity by the cut of their suit, and where Vanessa had traded her sister's soul for jewelry, was completely gutted of its suffocating vanity. The damp, peeling damask wallpaper was torn down, replaced by clean, bright whitewash that caught the winter sun. The barren mahogany tables were no longer empty monuments to aristocratic greed. They were pushed together, stretching from one end of the hall to the other, covered in heavy, steaming dishes of wholesome food, fresh bread, and hot tea. The room was filled with a new kind of resonance, the vibrant, chaotic warmth of communal meals, and the genuine, unforced laughter of those who truly understood the primal value of shelter. It became a refuge for the village laborers whose wages Richard had deferred, a temporary home for families displaced by the winter storms, and a learning center for young women seeking the very education Clara had been forced to fight for in the dark. The house was no longer a cage designed to insulate a fragile, predatory ego from the reality of the world. It had been converted into a sanctuary for the weary. The grand, soaring architecture, the high windows, the deep hearths, and the vast spaces that had for 3 centuries served only to make common men feel small finally served a real, human purpose. The stones of the manor were redeemed at last, washed clean of their historic cruelty by the very grace, intellect, and mercy that the Whitmore family had tried so desperately to extinguish. From her high-rise office in London, looking out over a city that would never own her, Clara Whitmore closed the final folder on Gloucestershire. She did not hate the house, and she no longer carried the weight of its ghosts. She had transformed their prison into a fortress of hope, leaving her family to wander the margins of a world that had forgotten them. While she stepped forward into a brilliant, limitless dawn of her own design, miles away from the decaying valley of Gloucestershire, the sprawling grid of the city lights shimmered like a sea of diamonds tossed against the vast, velvet night. The frantic hum of urban traffic, the distant chime of midnight bells, and the collective energy of millions of lives moving forward rose into the crisp air. But by the time it reached the high terrace, it was nothing more than a faint, rhythmic murmur. Clara stood on the balcony of her own home. It was a space designed with an entirely different philosophy than the manor, modest in its footprint, serene in its execution, characterized by clean lines, warm timber, and walls filled with books rather than stolen ancestral portraits. There were no drafty, suffocating halls here, no ghosts hiding in the wainscoting, and no frantic performances of status to maintain before an unforgiving audience. She held a single glass of deep red wine in her hand, the liquid catching the steady, amber glow of the interior lights behind her. There was no theatrical triumph in her expression, no manic joy of a conqueror standing over a fallen enemy, and absolutely no vengeful smirk on her lips. Such emotions were the currency of the small-minded, the very traits that had hollowed out her parents and sister, until they were nothing but husks. Clara had long since evolved past the need for their validation or their suffering to measure her own stature. Her victory was not that she had crushed them. Her victory was that she had outgrown them entirely. She simply looked out at the distant horizon, where the dark silhouette of the hills met the glowing edge of the metropolis. Her chest rose and falling in a steady, effortless, and rhythmic cadence. For the first time in 34 years, Clara Whitmore was finally breathing. She inhaled the crisp, biting air of an unburdened life, letting the clean cold fill her lungs without the bitter temps of soot, flour, or lie. The heavy, invisible chains of 1,000 days of unvowed servitude, the crushing obligation to save people who despised her, The silent agony of a stolen inheritance and the systemic erasure of her own identity had completely evaporated into the winter wind. She took a slow, quiet sip of her wine, then turned away from the edge of the balcony. As she stepped back inside, sliding the heavy glass door shut, the final echo of the Whitmore name died in the dark behind her. The ledger was balanced, the past was closed, and Clara walked forward into the light of her own unwritten dawn. The final hours of the new year did not bleed away quietly. They extracted the last remaining scraps of dignity from the drawing room like an unyielding tide. In the suffocating, freezing darkness that had settled over the manor since Clara disengaged the main circuit breaker, the cold had become a physical weight, pressing against the lungs of the three figures huddled on the floor. Richard's hands, stiff and clumsy from the frost, continued to blindly rummage through the deep leather satchel Clara had left behind on the scarred mahogany table. He was a man drowning in his own skin, desperately looking for a loophole, a single clause, or an oversight by a London clerk that might invalidate the foreclosure deeds. His blue-tinged fingers struck a separate, distinct folder hidden beneath the vellum sheets of the Stellar Holdings bundle. It was an old, heavy manila jacket, its corners yellowed and cracked, bearing the faded stamp of their former family solicitor from London. "Eleanor," Richard croaked, his voice a dry, rattling hiss that shook in the dark room. He dragged the folder down to the floor, his sightless eyes straining as a sudden, brilliant flash of lightning from the dying blizzard illuminated the room through the shattered window pane. "Eleanor, look at this. There is a secondary rider attached to the 2018 corporate restructuring. Light a match, light a page of the ledger. I need to see the corporate execution dates." With trembling, frantic movements, Eleanor struck a lone, scraping match against the floorboards, its small, sulphurous yellow, flare-casting monstrous, dancing shadows across their gaunt faces. She leaned over Richard's shoulder, her breath coming in short, hyperventilating plumes as they focused on the final page of the archaic document. The revelation did not arrive as a fresh threat from the daughter who had just abandoned them to the storm. It materialized as a chilling, unalterable historical fact, buried deep within a mountain of dry, administrative paperwork from 6 years prior, specifically masked under an appendix titled *Asset Management Downloading Protocol*. Clay, their own bold, unmistakable signatures. Richard's grand, sweeping script and Eleanor's sharp, delicate hand sat perfectly preserved at the bottom of the vellum page. Witnessed and sealed by a notary public, the Whitmores had voluntarily granted Clara full, unconditional power of attorney over every personal trust, corporate dividend, and property asset associated with the family name. A sickening, absolute silence fell over the room as the match burned down to Eleanor's raw fingers, dying with a faint hiss. The truth was far more devastating than a sudden corporate ambush. In the spring of 2018, blinded by their own intoxicating superiority, Richard and Eleanor had grown weary of what they called the tedious, low-class mechanics of estate administration. They had grown tired of reviewing tax invoices, signing agricultural leases, and balancing the timber yard ledger. In their supreme arrogance, believing that Clara was a docile, slow-witted appliance designed only to absorb their burdens, they had signed the omnibus document to completely free themselves from the clutter of their own wealth. They had been so utterly consumed by the performance of their own royalty, so busy choosing the patterns for the ballroom drapes and ignoring the girl who brought them their tea, that they had signed their own execution warrant without ever reading the text. They had handed the silent architect of their downfall the very blueprints of their lives. For 6 years, Clara had not been plotting a crime. She had been executing a mandate they had explicitly given her. She had bought their debts, frozen their accounts, and systematically dismantled their dynasty using the exact, legal ironclad authority they had tossed at her feet like a dirty apron just so they wouldn't have to strain their eyes. Richard let the folder slip from his numb fingers, the papers scattering into the dust and snow that covered the floor. The realization burned through the last remaining dregs of his patriarchal pride. They had not been outmaneuvered by an external enemy. They had locked the doors of their own prison, turned the key, and handed the iron ring to the daughter they deemed too insignificant to ever notice the cage closing around them. Life keeps a perfect, unforgiving ledger. What is planted in arrogance will eventually crumble, and what is sown in silent resilience will grow to conquer. Never underestimate a soul building their path in the dark. If you believe in the unyielding truth of human dignity, support this channel by liking and subscribing. Let's keep exploring the profound realities of life, together.